The 9,963rd meeting of the Security Council is resumed. I wish to remind all speakers to limit their statements to no more than 3 minutes in order to enable the Council to carry out its work expeditiously. The flashing light on the microphone will prompt speakers to bring their remarks to a close after 3 minutes. I now give the floor to the representative of Egypt.
خالص الشكر سيد الرئيس. يشرفني إلقاء هذا البيان باسم المجموعة العربية التي تعرب عن شكرها لباكستان على عقد هذا الاجتماع الذي يأتي في سياق خطير تتفاقم فيه المعاناة الإنسانية للشعب الفلسطيني على أرضه المحتلة. يتعرض قطاع غزة لعدوان غاشم تتحدى به إسرائيل كافة المواثيق الدولية وقرارات هذا المجلس. ترتكب خلاله إسرائيل إبادة من خلال القتل والتجويع المتعمد والتدمير المنظم بهدف اقتلاع الشعب الفلسطيني من أرضه عبر التهجير القسري. ولقد بلغ الوضع الإنساني في غزة مستوى كارثي. إن الحصار المفروض على غزة يعد عقابا جماعيا مرفوضا بكافة المقاييس. سيد الرئيس، رغم وضوح قرار مجلس الأمن 2735 الذي يهدف إلى وقف فوري ودائم وغير مشروط لإطلاق النار وضمان إيصال المساعدات الإنسانية دون عوائق، لا تزال إسرائيل تواصل حصار غزة وتمنع السكان من العودة إلى منازلهم وتستهدف المدارس والمراكز الطبية ومخيمات النازحين والعاملين في المجالين الإنساني والطبي والصحافيين، بل وتستخدم الغذاء والدواء كسلاح حرب وتفرض آليات توزيع للمساعدات لا تتسق مع القانون الدولي الإنساني والمعايير الإنسانية، بما يشكله ذلك من جرائم حرب وجزءا من سياسة ممنهجة لإعادة تشكيل الواقع الديموغرافي بالقوة. في هذا السياق تحذر المجموعة العربية من خطورة استخدام المساعدات كأداة للتهجير القسري والاستيلاء على الأراضي بالقوة، كما تجدد دعمها الكامل لوكالة الأونروا وتدين محاولات تقويض ولاياتها أو ضعف دورها، وتدعو المجتمع الدولي لتعزيز دعمه السياسي والمالي له. على صعيد آخر تثمن المجموعة العربية الجهود التي تبذلها مصر وقطر بالتعاون مع الولايات المتحدة في إطار المساعي الرامية للتوصل لاتفاق لوقف إطلاق النار وضمان تدفق المساعدات إلى قطاع غزة بشكل آمن ومستدام، بما يسهم في وضع حد للكارثة الإنسانية في القطاع. كما تدين المجموعة العربية الانتهاكات والجرائم الإسرائيلية في الضفة الغربية والقدس الشرقية، وتندد بمشروع القانون الذي صوت عليه الكنيسة الإسرائيلي اليوم والرامي لفرض السيادة الإسرائيلية على الضفة الغربية وغور الأردن. كما تدين قيام جيش الاحتلال باستهداف دور العبادة في كافة الأرض الفلسطينية وتعده انتهاكا سافرا للقانون الدولي الإنساني. تجدد المجموعة دعمها للوصاية الهاشمية على المقدسات الإسلامية والمسيحية بالقدس، كما تشدد على وجوب احترام الوضع القانوني والتاريخي القائم للمقدسات في المدينة المقدسة، وتثمن دور لجنة القدس وكذلك بيت مال القدس في الدفاع عن المدينة وصمود أهلها. سيد الرئيس، ترحب المجموعة العربية باعتماد قرار الجمعية العامة في دورتها الاستثنائية العاشرة في 12 من يونيو الماضي، وتدعو مجلس الأمن إلى دعم تنفيذه الكامل، بما في ذلك إنهاء الاحتلال فورا ووقف المجازر وضمان الحماية الكاملة للمدنيين. وتدعو المجتمع الدولي إلى تحمل مسؤولياته دون تقاعس لإنهاء العدوان ورفع الحصار عن قطاع غزة وكافة الأراضي الفلسطينية، وتوفير الحماية الدولية للشعب الفلسطيني ومساءلة مرتكبي الجرائم بحقه، بما يعيد الحياة الكريمة إلى أهل غزة. كما تدعو أيضا إلى دعم خطة التعافي المبكر وإعادة إعمار وتنمية غزة المعتمدة من جميع الدول العربية والنظام التعاون الإسلامي والمشاركة بفعالية في المؤتمر الذي تعتزم القاهرة استضافته لحشد الدعم والتمويل لتلك الخطة التي تعد أساسا لمستقبل جديد للقطاع تحت حكم وإدارة السلطة الفلسطينية وتؤكد مجددا على أهمية انعقاد مؤتمر الأمم المتحدة رفيع المستوى بشأن التسوية السلمية قضية فلسطين وتنفيذ حل الدولتين وقرارات الأمم المتحدة ذات الصلة برئاسة مشتركة من السعودية وفرنسا. وتدعو جميع الدول الأعضاء في الأمم المتحدة إلى المشاركة بفعالية في ذلك المؤتمر 28 إلى 30 يوليو الحالي. تدين المجموعة العربية أيضا بانتهاك إسرائيل لإعلان وقف الأعمال العدائية في لبنان بشكل يومي منذ دخوله حيز التنفيذ في 27 نوفمبر 2024 عبر ارتكاب الخروقات الجوية والبرية وشن الغارات يوميا بما أدى إلى مقتل وجرح المئات. بالمقابل يلتزم لبنان ببنود الاتفاق بالكامل ويعمل على تنفيذها بإصرار وبالسرعة الممكنة. كما تدين المجموعة استمرار احتلال إسرائيل 5 مواقع حدودية في الجنوب اللبناني إضافة إلى تعيين منطقتين عازلتين ضمن الأراضي اللبنانية ومنع الوصول إليهما. كما يمنع الاحتلال أيضا الانتشار الكامل للجيش اللبناني جنوب نهر الليطاني ويعطل حرية حركة قوات اليونيفيل ووصولها إلى بعض مواقعها الحدودية. كل ذلك يشكل انتهاكا صارخا لسيادة لبنان والقرار 1701 وخرقا فاضحا لإعلان وقف الأعمال العدائية. في هذا الإطار تؤكد المجموعة العربية ضرورة أن يطلع مجلس الأمن بمسؤولياته لإلزام السلطة القائمة بالاحتلال بالانسحاب الكامل والفوري وغير المشروط من كافة الأراضي اللبنانية المحتلة. وتشيد المجموعة بالتقدم المستمر في نشر الجيش اللبناني جنوب الليطاني وأحرص تقدم في حصر السلاح وبسط سلطة الدولة. كما تدعو لتوفير الدعم من الدول الصديقة لتعزيز قدرات القوات المسلحة اللبنانية والمساعدة في إعادة الأعمار وتؤكد الوقوف مع لبنان ودعم أمنه وحفظ سيادته. سيد الرئيس، تعرب المجموعة العربية عن إدانتها لإمعان إسرائيل في استباحة السيادة السورية من خلال الغارات الجوية التي شنتها مؤخرا على دمشق. وتدين المجموعة العربية هذا العدوان الذي يمثل اعتداء صارخا على سيادة دولة عربية شقيقة، وأنها تؤكد أن هذه الغارات تمثل انتهاكا خطيرا للقانون الدولي والميثاق الأممي. تؤكد المجموعة أن أمن سوريا واستقرارها يمثلان جزءا لا يتجزأ من المنظومة الأمنية الإقليمية والدولية، وأن الحفاظ على سيادتها وحدة أراضيها يمثل التزاما عربيا ودوليا غير قابل للمساواة. كما تشدد أيضا على حرصها على شمولية العملية السياسية وعلى أهمية القضاء على خطر العناصر والمجموعات الإرهابية والمقاتلين الإرهابيين. إن استمرار إسرائيل في انتهاك سيادة الدول العربية يشكل خطرا على الأمن الجماعي الإقليمي والدولي ويقوض مصداقية النظام الدولي. المجموعة العربية تدين هذه السياسات العدوانية فإنها تطالب مجلس الأمن بالتحرك الفوري وتحمل مسؤولياته في التصدي لهذه الانتهاكات وإلزام إسرائيل بالوقف الفوري لعدوانها والانصياع الكامل للقانون الدولي والانسحاب من جميع الأراضي الفلسطينية والسورية واللبنانية المحتلة. سيد الرئيس، أتحدث بإذنكم بصفتي الوطنية أيضا فأدعوكم جميعا لوضع أنفسكم في موقف مواطن فلسطيني من أهلنا الكرام في غزة يتعرض لاعتداءات وجرائم ضارية لأكثر من عام ونصف قتلت أكثر من 58,000 شهيد. يتخيل كل منكم مقتل أطفاله أمام أعينه ليلحقوا بأكثر من 17,000 طفل آخرين. تخيلوا أنفسكم تنزحون لأكثر من 10 مرات وتعرضون لأسوأ حملة تجويع في القرن الحالي. تطالبون بالحق في الحياة فيرفض هذا الطلب لرغبة إسرائيلية في الانتقام الأعمى. سيد الرئيس، في هذا السياق المؤلم تود مصر أن تؤكد على ما يلي. أولا ستواصل مصر جهود الوساطة بالتنسيق مع قطر والولايات المتحدة لإرساء وقف إطلاق نار فوري ودائم، إطلاق سراح الرهائن والأسرى وفتح المعابر وإنفاذ المساعدات لقطاع غزة دون أي تعوائق. وتعتزم فور التوصل لهذا الاتفاق استضافة مؤتمر دولي بالقاهرة لحشد الدعم والتمويل للخطة العربية الإسلامية للتعافي المبكر وإعادة إعمار غزة بالتنسيق الكامل مع دولة فلسطين والأمم المتحدة. ثانيا تطالبكم مصر مجددا بإصدار مجلس الأمن لقرار يلزم إسرائيل بوقف اعتداءاتها على غزة وتنفيذ قرارات مجلس الأمن خاصة القرار 2735. هذه مسؤولية لا يمكن التنصل منها. مثل هذا القرار سيكون معززا للمفاوضات ودافعا لتحقيق وقف. ثالثا تطالب مصر أيضا بتدخل المجتمع الدولي الفوري لرفع الحصار الإسرائيلي عن غزة، التجويع الرامي لإيصال القطاع لحافة المجاعة، والسماح بإدارة الأمم المتحدة وشركائها للعمل الإنساني بعد أن بات واضحا للعيان رفض المجتمع الدولي للنموذج الإسرائيلي الحالي وفي القلب منه منظمة غزة الإنسانية لكونه يتنافى مع القانون الدولي الإنساني والمبادئ الإنسانية كما عرفناه، ولا تحوله لفخ للقتل أوقع المئات من المدنيين. لنكن صرحاء، هذه ليست آلية إنسانية بل أداة لامتهان الكرامة الإنسانية والتجويع والقتل. كما تشدد مصر على رفضها القاطع لأي مخططات رامية لإنشاء ما يسمى بمدن إنسانية في جنوب غزة. تعتبر مصر هذه المخططات تهجيرا قسريا وجريمة حرب لا يتعين قبولها تحت أي مبرر. رابعا تشدد مصر على أمرين: الأول إنفاذ المساءلة إداء الجرائم التي ارتكبتها إسرائيل والتي يتفاخر بها عدد من مسؤوليها، خاصة بحق الأطفال الذين تقتل إسرائيل منهم يوميا عددا يماثل حجم فصل دراسي. والأمر الثاني هو وجوبية إلزام إسرائيل بجبر الضرر والتعويض عن الدمار الذي تسببت به. ليس من العدل أن يسمح لإسرائيل بتدمير القطاع مرة تلو الأخرى ليدفع المجتمع الدولي الثمن. إنفاذ المساءلة والتعويض هما الحل الوحيد لردع الجاني عن تكرار جرائمه. خامسا تأمل مصر ألا يغفل مجلس الأمن عن وضع الحرج الذي تمر به الضفة الغربية والقدس الشرقية على ضوء العمليات العسكرية الإسرائيلية وتصاعد جرائم المستوطنين وبناء المستوطنات وتزايد هدم المنازل والمنشآت الفلسطينية وتهجير الفلسطينيين من مساكنهم ومنع الأونروا من العمل والاقتحامات المتكررة للأماكن المقدسة في القدس ومساس بوضعها القانوني والتاريخي خاصة المسجد. ختاما سيد الرئيس سادة أعضاء مجلس الأمن، إذا كان هدف اليمين الإسرائيلي المتطرف إرهاب الشعب الفلسطيني للتخلي عن قضيته، فكافة الجرائم منذ دير ياسين وما بعدها لم تفلح في تصفية قضيته، بل على العكس زادت الشعب الفلسطيني إصرارا على التمسك بحقه. ويجب أن تفهم إسرائيل وداعميها أن الاستقرار والسلام في الشرق الأوسط لن يتحقق سوى بالتسوية السلمية لمسألة فلسطين بشكل عادل وشامل على أساس إنهاء الاحتلال وتمكين الشعب الفلسطيني لدولته المستقلة على حدود 4 من يونيو وعاصمتها القدس الشرقية. هذا هو الحل الوحيد الذي سيقبل به الشعبان الفلسطيني والعربي. خالص الشكر وآسف على الإطالة.
Mr. President, and I apologize for speaking at length. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished permanent representative of Egypt for the statements in the national capacity and on behalf of the Arab group. I now give the floor to His Excellency Maged Abdulaziz, Permanent Observer of the League of Arab States to the United Nations.
شكرا سيد الرئيس. السيد الرئيس، يسعدني باسم جامعة الدول العربية وأمينها العام أن أتقدم لكم بالتهنئة على رئاسة جمهورية باكستان الإسلامية المتميزة لمجلس الأمن لشهر يوليو، وعلى الموضوعات الهامة التي طرحتموها للمناقشة تحت هذه الرئاسة، والتي تؤكد على دعم باكستان الكامل للنظام الدولي المتعدد الأطراف ولنظام الأمن الجماعي الدولي ولحكم القانون الدولي وقانون الدولي الإنساني، وترسخ من دعم المجلس للتعاون مع جامعة الدول العربية ومنظمة المؤتمر التعاون الإسلامي وغيرها. وأود بصفة خاصة أن أشيد بحرص معالي نائب رئيس الوزراء ووزير الخارجية على رئاسة هذه الجلسة على المستوى الوزاري. السيد الرئيس، تمر أزمة الشرق الأوسط بواحدة من أخطر مراحلها منذ قيام جامعة الدول العربية والأمم المتحدة 80 عاماً مضت. تسببت فيها فشل التعامل الدولي مع القضية الفلسطينية، خاصة مع استمرار الاعتداءات الإسرائيلية الوحشية دون انقطاع على قطاع غزة بالمخالفة للقرارات الصادرة عن هذا المجلس وبالتناقض مع اتفاق الهدنة السابق التوصل إليه وما يتزامن معها من القيود الغير إنسانية التي تفرضها إسرائيل على دخول المساعدات الإنسانية إلى قطاع غزة، والتي برزت تداعياتها الكارثية بجلاء للإحاطات القيمة العاكسة للحقيقة المجردة التي أدلى بها وكيل السكرتير العام فليتشر والمديرة التنفيذية لليونيسف في الجلسة التي عقدها المجلس بناء على مبادرة الدول الأوروبية بالمجلس التي دعمتها المجموعة العربية وممثلها بالمجلس الجزائري الأسبوع الماضي. ومن الإحاطة المتميزة التي استمعنا إليها اليوم أيضا من مساعد السكرتير العام وقد أبرزت جلسة اليوم مثلما الجلسة السابقة حجم المأساة الإنسانية المتفاقمة يوما بعد يوم التي يعيشها الشعب الفلسطيني في الأرض الفلسطينية المحتلة بكاملها، وخاصة في قطاع غزة بعد استهداف إسرائيل المتعمد لكافة وكالات الإغاثة وعلى رأسها وكالة الأونروا، وإعاقتها عمدا لدخول الغذاء والوقود وكافة مستلزمات الإعاشة في حملة شرسة من التجويع تهدف لدفع سكان القطاع نحو الهجرة القسرية، بل وفرض إسرائيل لتوزيع المساعدات بمعرفة الجيش الإسرائيلي من خلال آلية مصطنعة غير معترف بها منذ مايو 2025 قادت أنشطتها غير الشرعية لاستشهاد ما يقرب من 800 فلسطيني من المدنيين الأبرياء حتى اليوم لمجرد سعيهم للحصول على الغذاء وتفادي الموت جوعاً. ويزيد الأمر سخرية سعي إسرائيل لإقامة ما تطلق عليه المدينة الإنسانية في جنوب قطاع غزة رغم أن كل ممارساتها وانتهاكاتها تبتعد عن الإنسانية تمام البعد، بل وينطبق عليها فقط التوصيف القانوني للجرائم ضد الإنسانية وجريمة الإبادة الجماعية وجرائم الحرب. ورغم صدور الأمر الرأي الاستشاري لمحكمة العدل الدولية في يوليو 24 وإصدار المحكمة للعديد من الأوامر الوقتية الهادفة للحيلولة دون استمرار هذه الجرائم على الأرض، وما زالت إسرائيل تمعن في رفض تنفيذ ما ورد بها من أحكام، تماما كما ترفض تنفيذ كافة قرارات مجلس الأمن الصادرة بوقت إطلاق النار وترفض السماح بدخول المساعدات الإنسانية وتسعى دون انقطاع إلى التهجير refuses to ensure the large-scale entry of humanitarian aid and relentlessly pursues the forced displacement of Palestinians from Gaza under the pretext of eliminating the Hamas movement. Israel continues to refuse to recognize the independent state of Palestine and, along with its allies, to obstruct its full membership to the United Nations. Israel continues in its blatant aggression against Islamic and Christian holy sites in all of their denominations across the occupied Palestinian territories, particularly the Al-Aqsa. ولذا فإن جامعة الدول العربية تطالب الأجهزة القضائية الدولية بالقيام بدور أكثر فاعلية وقوة. على محكمة العدل الدولية تقييم مدى التزام إسرائيل بالأوامر الوقتية الصادرة assess Israel's compliance with the provisional measures issued in the genocide case brought by South Africa and other countries, and this as soon as possible. The court should issue firmer, stronger provisional measures that should be binding in nature. Under Chapter 7 of the UN Charter, the League also urges the ICJ to expedite the publication of its advisory opinion requested by the General Assembly based on a Norwegian initiative regarding Israel's obligations under the UN Convention on Privileges and Immunities, particularly in relation to its ban on UNRWA activities, which is the only UN agency able to effectively deliver aid to Palestinian refugees living in all 5 areas of operation. Similarly, the International Criminal Court must step up its efforts to enforce arrest warrants against Prime Minister Netanyahu and former Defense Minister Gallant. It's essential to include in the arrest warrants other members of the extremist Israeli government whose hands are also stained with blood and to bring them to justice. In a few days, the International Conference for the implementation of the two-state solution will be held.
بفرض السيادة الإسرائيلية على الضفة الغربية وغور الأردن الذي من شأنه أن يدمر كل فرص تحقيق السلام العادل والشامل في المنطقة. سيد الرئيس، بعد أيام قليلة ينعقد المؤتمر الدولي لتنفيذ حل الدولتين الذي زرعت الدول العربية بذرته الأولى في المبادرة العربية للسلام التي أطلقتها المملكة العربية السعودية واعتمدتها قمة بيروت عام 2002 وسعت لإعادة إحيائها منذ 3 سنوات لإقامة تحالف دعم تنفيذ حل الدولتين بمبادرة من المملكة العربية السعودية ومصر والأردن وبمشاركة رئيسية من الجامعة العربية ودولها الأعضاء جميعا والاتحاد الأوروبي ومعظم الدول الأعضاء فيه وغيرهم. ولا شك أن انعقاد هذا المؤتمر يشكل انطلاقة جديدة في مسار موازن يهدف لخلق الأفق السياسي الكفيل بتهدئة الأوضاع وإنجاح جهود الوساطة القطرية المصرية الأمريكية للتوصل للوقف الفوري لإطلاق النار وإدخال المساعدات بكثافة والبدء في تنفيذ خطة التعافي وإعادة الإعمار التي اعتمدتها القمة العربية بالقاهرة وأقرتها منظمة التعاون الإسلامي وتحظى بدعم كبير من الاتحاد الأوروبي وغيره من المنظمات الأخرى. وتتوافق هذه الرسالة مع الرسائل الصادرة عن جهات دولية أخرى عديدة آخرها مؤتمر دكار حول القدس ومؤتمر مجموعة لاهاي في كولومبيا والبيان الصادر عن 28 دولة منهم 21 دولة عضو في الاتحاد الأوروبي بالإضافة إلى المملكة المتحدة وكندا واستراليا وسويسرا واليابان والنرويج ونيوزيلندا التي طلبت جميعها بوقف الإبادة الجماعية في فلسطين وبالاعتراف الفوري بدولة فلسطين كخطوة قانونية وأخلاقية محورية تساهم في حماية حقوق الشعب الفلسطيني في أرض ودولته. ولتشارك جامعة الدول العربية في كل هذه الأنشطة وتدعم أعمال هذا المؤتمر الدولي على أعلى مستوى مع القوى الأخرى المحبة للسلام والسعي للتوصل للأمن والاستقرار لجميع أطرافها تحت مظلة الجمعية العامة وتدفع بقوة لكي يعتمد هذا المؤتمر إجراءات عملية لا يمكن التراجع عنها لدعم فرص تنفيذ حل الدولتين وتعظيم الاعتراف الدولي بالدولة الفلسطينية فإنها تتطلع للتوصل في أقرب فرصة لاتفاق شامل للوقف الفوري لإطلاق النار بما يفتح الباب أمام مرحلة جديدة من العمل السياسي المكثف الهادف لدعم قدرات الدولة الفلسطينية المستقلة
the aim of which is to strengthen the capabilities of the independent Palestinian state in accordance with international legitimacy and Security Council resolutions. This would involve the full and active participation of all concerned parties under the leadership of the Palestinian Authority and government as well as Israel. And it is to this end that the Arab League Council yesterday in Cairo adopted an important resolution at the level of permanent representatives that underscored the need for parallel action on two fronts. First, to create a political horizon for a peaceful settlement, and secondly, to achieve a ceasefire, the entry of aid and launching the recovery and reconstruction plan. To conclude, Mr. President, Israel must understand that its continued military operations against Palestine, Syria, and Lebanon will not change its status as a foreign occupying power in Arab lands, and that the pursuit of Israeli military aggression will not prevent the Arab League and all of its member states from intensifying their efforts to consolidate the foundations of an independent Palestinian state and to recover the occupied Syrian and Lebanese territories. Israel must be well aware that it cannot, through military force or alliances with certain major powers, impose its dominance over the region of the Middle East, or to impose a new status on Israel in the region while remaining an occupying state. While the many Arab peoples opened their door to peace, they did so for a peace based on mutual respect and the achievement of common interests for all peoples in the Arab region and in the region, particularly the peoples of the state of Palestine, Syria, and Lebanon on the one hand, and the people of Israel on the other. So, as to ensure that everyone in the region may live together without exception in a framework of coexistence based on justice and equality, and not on the basis of illusions such as subordination or dominance or hegemony that some impose through military arrogance or political alliances. That has never happened and will never happen in the Middle East. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Abdelaziz for the statement, and I'll give the floor to the representative of Switzerland.
Merci, Monsieur le Président. Excellences, chers
Thank you,
collègues.
President.
Je remercie
Excellencies,
le Pakistan pour
colleagues, I'd like
l'organisation
to
de ce
thank
débat
Pakistan
consacré
for convening
à la
this
situation au
debate
Moyen-Orient.
on the situation in the
La
Middle
Suisse est
East.
bouleversée par les souffrances
Switzerland
humaines
is deeply
insoutenables à
disturbed
Gaza,
by the
où les
unbearable
civils
human
sont en
suffering
proie
in
aux
Gaza,
hostilités
where civilians
incessantes,
are caught
aux
up in
déplacements de masse et
relentless
aux risques élevés
hostilities,
de famine.
mass displacement,
En
and the
vertu de
heightened
la
risk
4e
of
Convention
famine.
de Genève,
Under the
Israël
4th
a,
Geneva
en tant que
Convention,
puissance
Israel, as the
occupante,
occupying power,
l'obligation d'approvisionner
has an obligation
inconditionnellement
to
et de
provide
façon adéquate
unconditional
toute la
and
population
adequate
sous son
supplies
contrôle en biens
of
et
essential
services
goods and
essentiels.
services to the entire
Israël
population
ne
under its
respecte
control.
pas cette obligation.
Israel is not
Lorsque
fulfilling
la
this
population n'est
obligation.
pas approvisionnée de
When the
manière
population is
adéquate, les
not
parties au
adequately
conflit
supplied,
ont
the
l'obligation
parties to the
d'autoriser
conflict
et de
have an
faciliter
obligation to allow
l'acheminement
and
rapide,
facilitate
sûr et
the
sans
rapid,
entrave
safe,
de
and
l'aide
unimpeded
humanitaire à
passage
toutes les
of
personnes dans le
humanitarian
besoin.
assistance to
Cette
all persons
obligation
in need.
porte sur le
This
résultat et
obligation
pas
is
seulement sur les moyens
results-based. It's
mis à
not merely
disposition.
an
Ni le
obligation of
Hamas ni
means.
Israël ne
Neither
respectent
Hamas
cette
nor
obligation.
Israel
Nous rappelons en
is
outre
complying
que
with this
l'usage de
obligation.
la
We'd
famine
also
comme
like to
méthode
recall
de
that the
guerre
use
est
of
interdit
starvation
et
as a
constitue
method
un
of
crime de
warfare
guerre.
is prohibited
Il est
and constitutes a
inacceptable
war
que des
crime.
centaines
It's
de civils aient
unacceptable
été tués
for
et des
hundreds of
milliers
civilians to
blessés
have been
alors qu'ils
killed
étaient à la
and
recherche de
thousands
nourriture,
injured while
notamment
seeking
près des
food.
centres de distribution
This also
opérés
occurred
par la Gaza
near
Humanitarian
distribution
Foundation.
centers operated by
Nous
the Gaza
exigeons que
Humanitarian
des enquêtes
Foundation. We
indépendantes
demand
soient
that
menées sur
independent
ces
investigations
incidents.
be conducted
La
into these
militarisation de
incidents.
l'aide porte
The
gravement
militarization
atteinte
of
aux
aid
principes humanitaires
seriously
et aux
undermines
normes
humanitarian principles
internationales.
as well as
La
international
Suisse soutient
norms.
les acteurs et actrices humanitaires qui
Switzerland
respectent les
supports
principes
humanitarian
d'humanité,
actors who
de
respect the
neutralité,
principles of
d'impartialité et
humanity,
d'indépendance,
neutrality,
notamment les
impartiality, and
agences
independence.
onusiennes
In
et leurs
particular,
partenaires.
UN agencies
La
and their
Gaza
partners.
Humanitarian Foundation
The Gaza
ne
Humanitarian
remplit
Foundation
clairement pas ces
clearly
critères.
does not
Pire,
meet the
ces
aforementioned
activités
criteria.
engendrent de graves violations
Worse
du
still,
droit
its
international
activities are giving
humanitaire.
rise to serious
Nous appelons
violations
le
of international
gouvernement israélien
humanitarian
à
law.
lever
We call
immédiatement
on the
toutes
Israeli
les
government to
restrictions, y
immediately lift
compris à
all
l'espace de la
restrictions,
société civile,
including
afin de
those
permettre aux
imposed
organisations
on civil society,
internationales,
so that
aux
international
organisations non
organizations,
gouvernementales et aux
NGOs,
médias
and the
d'effectuer leur
media
travail de
can
manière sûre et
conduct their
efficace.
work
Nous sommes fortement
safely
préoccupés par
and
l'extension
effectively.
des hostilités
We are
par
deeply
Israël,
disquieted by the
désormais aussi
expansion
à
of
Deir
hostilities by
al-Balah,
Israel,
avec des
now also to
conséquences
Deir al-Balah.
désastreuses sur les
This has
civils,
disastrous
ainsi que
consequences
les
for
opérations et
civilians
les
and
infrastructures
humanitarian
humanitaires.
operations
Toute
and
attaque
infrastructure.
contre ceux-ci,
Any
tels
attacks
que rapportés notamment
against
à
these,
Deir al-Balah,
as
est contraire
like
au
those
droit
reported
international
in particular in
humanitaire.
Deir al-Balah, are
Enfin,
contrary
nous nous
to international
inquiétons de
humanitarian law.
l'annonce par Israël de l'établissement d'une
Furthermore, we're
soi-disant
concerned
cité
by Israel's
humanitaire au
announcement
sud de Gaza.
that it will be
Nous
establishing a
rappelons
so-called
notamment que le
humanitarian city in
transfert
southern
forcé
Gaza.
de
We'd like to
population
recall
est strictement
that the
interdit
forcible
en droit
transfer of
international
populations is
humanitaire
strictly
et
prohibited
constitue
under
un
international
crime de
humanitarian
guerre.
law and constitutes
Monsieur
a
le
war
Président,
crime.
President, since the acts of terror perpetrated by Hamas on the 7th of October 2023, which we've strongly condemned, the region has been swept up in a dangerous spiral of violence. In Gaza, Switzerland urges the parties, through the mediation of the US, Qatar, and Egypt, urges the parties to reach a permanent ceasefire, which would include the release of all hostages and unimpeded humanitarian access. At the regional level, diplomatic channels must remain active to ensure the implementation of various ceasefire commitments, as well as to achieve a cessation of all hostilities. Switzerland's good officers are at the parties' disposal with a view to de-escalation. However, the escalation of violence in Syria and also between Syria and Israel only serves to exacerbate regional instability. Against this backdrop, Switzerland would like to condemn all recent violations of international law. International humanitarian law requires for civilians to be afforded protection at all times. In accordance with the UN Charter, the sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence of all countries in the region must be painstakingly respected. Finally, all obstacles to peace in the Middle East conflict must be lifted one by one. Switzerland condemns the repeated decisions taken by the Israeli government to expand settlements and outposts in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and this against a backdrop of military escalation and rising violence perpetrated by Israeli settlers with impunity. The Israeli occupation, including the settlements, are illegal. This has been confirmed by the ICJ. This must end. The occupation is an obstacle to the Security Council's vision of a region comprised of two democratic states, Israel and Palestine, living side by side in peace and within secure and mutually recognized borders. Switzerland supports this vision and urges all parties to commit to a political solution. Switzerland will actively participate in the international conference for the peaceful settlement of the question of Palestine, as well as the implementation of the two-state solution, organized by France and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia under the auspices of the United Nations here in New York next week. I thank you.
Thanking the representative of Switzerland for this statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Jordan.
بداية أتقدم إليكم بجزيل الشكر على ما بذلتموه وتبذلوه من جهد مقدر في تيسير أعمال مجلس الأمن للشهر الجاري، متمنيا لكم التوفيق والسداد. سيد الرئيس، يشكل وقف العدوان الإسرائيلي على قطاع غزة أولوية إنسانية وأخلاقية وسياسية، فالوضع الذي تعيشه غزة هو كارثة غير مسبوقة يتجلى فيها تجويع أكثر من مليوني غزي وحرمانهم من الماء والغذاء والدواء وأبسط مقومات الحياة، في انتهاك فاضح للقانون الدولي الإنساني والأوامر الصادرة عن محكمة العدل الدولية. وقد وثقت التقارير الأممية حجم المأساة والدمار الهائل الذي يشهده القطاع من انهيار كامل للخدمات الأساسية والإنسانية. يطالب الأردن بوقف فوري وشامل للعدوان الإسرائيلي على غزة وضمان الإدخال الفوري والكافي والمستدام للمساعدات الإنسانية إلى كافة أرجاء القطاع والسماح للمنظمات الإنسانية الأممية بإيصال المساعدات لمواجهة الوضع الإنساني الكارثي الذي يسود القطاع مع نفاذ الغذاء والدواء ووصول معدلات الجوع وسوء التغذية بين الأطفال إلى مستويات غير مسبوقة. في الوقت الذي يعاني فيه القطاع الصحي من تدمير واسع النطاق، حيث أن 17 مستشفى من أصل 37 تعمل بشكل جزئي، وأن 70% من الأدوية الأساسية غير متوفرة. منذ الأول من تموز وحتى تاريخه أرسلت المملكة 3 قوافل مساعدات إنسانية لقطاع غزة عبر الممر الإنساني الأردني تضم 111 شاحنة. وفي هذا السياق نؤكد على جاهزية الأردن التامة لإرسال مئات الشاحنات يوميا إلى القطاع فور رفع إسرائيل للقيود غير القانونية التي تفرضها على وصول المساعدات الإنسانية، إذ أن كميات المساعدات الإنسانية المرسلة لا تغدو قطرة في بحر الاحتياجات الإنسانية الأساسية لسكان القطاع. السيد الرئيس، يدعم الأردن الجهود التي تبذلها جمهورية مصر العربية ودولة قطر والولايات المتحدة الأمريكية للتوصل إلى وقف دائم لإطلاق النار في قطاع غزة. كما يرحب الأردن ببيان وزراء الخارجية 25 دولة الداعي إلى الوقف الفوري للحرب على غزة واحترام القانون الدولي ورفض التهجير والتغيير الديمغرافي. ونثمن مواقف تلك الدول بشأن وقف الاستيطان وحماية المدنيين وضمان وصول المساعدات ودعمها للجهود الرامية إلى التوصل إلى وقف دائم لإطلاق النار. سيد الرئيس، تدين المملكة استهداف إسرائيل للأعيان المدنية ودور العبادة وآخرها قصف كنيسة دير اللاتين في قطاع غزة، ما أسفر عن مقتل وإصابة العشرات، وتطالب مجلس الأمن بضمان امتثال إسرائيل بصفتها القوى القائمة بالاحتلال لالتزاماتها بموجب القانون الدولي واتفاقية جنيف الرابعة لعام 1949. كما يدين الأردن استمرار إسرائيل في أنشطتها الاستيطانية في الضفة الغربية المحتلة وانتهاكاتها الرامية إلى تقويض حل الدولتين، ويحذر من استئناف المشروع الاستيطاني E1 في شرقي القدس المحتلة. كما ندين تصويت الكنيسة الإسرائيلي اليوم على بيان لدعم السيادة الإسرائيلية على الضفة الغربية والأغوار الفلسطينية المحتلة انتهاكا صارخا للقانون الدولي وتقويضا لحل الدولتين ولحق الشعب الفلسطيني في تجسيد دولته المستقلة ذات السيادة على خطوط الرابع من حزيران لعام 1967 وعاصمتها القدس الشرقية. ويجدد الأردن إدانته لاقتحامات المستوطنين ووزراء الحكومة الإسرائيلية للمسجد الأقصى المبارك الحرم القدسي الشريف التي تتم بحماية الشرطة الإسرائيلية في انتهاك للوضع القانوني والتاريخي القائم ولالتزامات إسرائيل بصفتها القوى القائمة بالاحتلال. ونشدد على أن هذه الممارسات والاقتحامات لا تلغي حقيقة أن القدس الشرقية مدينة محتلة لا سيادة لإسرائيل عليها. كما يؤكد الأردن في هذا السياق على الدور التاريخي للوصاية الهاشمية في الدفاع عن المقدسات الإسلامية والمسيحية في القدس والحفاظ على هويتها العربية. سيد الرئيس، يدعو الأردن المجتمع الدولي إلى توفير الدعم السياسي والمالي لوكالة الأونروا لتمكينها من أداء مهامها الحيوية في الضفة الغربية والقدس الشرقية وقطاع غزة وسائر مناطق عملها الخمس وفقا لولاياتها الأممية. ونؤكد على ضرورة التصدي لكافة الإجراءات الإسرائيلية الهادفة إلى تقويض الوكالة وتصفيتها. ختاما، يطالب الأردن المجتمع الدولي بتحمل مسؤولياته في حماية المدنيين الفلسطينيين وإنهاء الاحتلال وإطلاق مسار سياسي جاد وفاعل يستند إلى المرجعيات الدولية ويفضي إلى تحقيق حل الدولتين بما يضمن للشعب الفلسطيني نيل حقوقه المشروعة وفقا للقرارات الأممية. ويؤكد أن القضية الفلسطينية هي القضية المركزية وأن السلام العادل والشامل لن يتحقق إلا بتجسيد الدولة الفلسطينية المستقلة ذات السيادة على خطوط الرابع من حزيران لعام 1967 وعاصمتها القدس الشرقية.
I thank the representative of Jordan and now give the floor to the permanent representative of Qatar.
شكرا لكم سيد الرئيس. بداية نرحب بحضور سعادة السناتور محمد إسحاق نائب رئيس الوزراء ووزير خارجية جمهورية باكستان الإسلامية صباح اليوم. كما ننضم لبيانات باسم كل من المجموعة الخليجية والعربية والإسلامية وحركة عدم الانحياز ونشكر سيد الرئيس ينعقد اجتماعنا اليوم ومستوى الحالة الإنسانية في قطاع غزة تعجز البرهان عن وصفه
While there are no words to describe the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip, as the USG for Humanitarian Affairs confirmed before your council, in light of the spread of famine, the collapse of infrastructure and the health system, and the outbreak of pandemics, with the death toll exceeding 58,000 people, including nearly 18,000 children. The state of Qatar condemns the continued attacks by the Israeli occupation on civilian objects, including hospitals, schools, and population centers. The state of Qatar stresses that the displacement of Palestinians in any form constitutes a flagrant violation of international humanitarian law. The state of Qatar also stresses its rejection of the use of food as a weapon of war and starvation of civilians, and calls on the international community to compel Israel to ensure safe, sustainable, and unhindered humanitarian access and its distribution by international humanitarian organizations. We also reiterate our rejection of attempts to end the role of UNRWA, while stressing the need to support the agency to be able to implement its mandate as approved and adopted by the GA. In view of this grave situation, the state of Qatar has made sincere efforts with the Arab Republic of Egypt and the United States of America to reach an agreement between the two sides for a permanent ceasefire, the exchange of prisoners and detainees, stemming the bloodshed, the return of displaced persons to their homes, and the provision of humanitarian assistance and basic needs to civilians throughout the Gaza Strip. Diplomatic efforts have proven that it is possible to make real achievements, as was done in previous agreements, and hence these efforts continue intensively to bring the views of the parties closer and reach an agreement urgently. Mr. President, we should not lose sight of the unprecedented deterioration of the humanitarian and security situation in the occupied West Bank. The state of Qatar condemns the statements made by the Minister of Justice of the occupation government regarding the annexation of the West Bank, and considers them an extension of the occupation settlement policies and a flagrant violation of international law and Security Council Resolution 2334. It also strongly condemns the approval by the occupying authorities of the construction of new settlement units and attacks carried out by settlers in an ongoing series of crimes against the defenseless Palestinian people. It stresses the need for the international community to act urgently to provide necessary protection for civilians and ensure that there is no impunity. The state of Qatar condemns the occupation's attempts to undermine the religious and historical status of the holy sites, including the storming of Al-Aqsa Mosque by Israeli officials and settlers, as well as the closure of the Jerusalem Fund and Endowment and the transfer of the management of the Ibrahimi Mosque to the Jewish Religious Council. Mr. President, the state of Qatar has warned of the dangers of the spillover of the conflict and the consequences of Israel's escalation in the region, stressing the priority of diplomatic solutions. In this regard, the state of Qatar condemns the attacks launched by the Israeli occupation on Syria, considers them a grave violation of international law, and reaffirms its support for the brotherly Syrian Arab Republic, its sovereignty, territorial integrity, and national unity, and the realization of the aspirations of its people for stability and development. The state of Qatar also reiterates its firm position in support of the brotherly Lebanese Republic and its territorial integrity, and stresses the need for the withdrawal of the Israeli occupying forces from all Lebanese territory. It calls on all parties to strictly abide by the ceasefire agreement. Mr. President, the state of Qatar welcomes the resumption of the convening of the high-level international conference on the peaceful settlement of the Palestinian question and the implementation of the two-state solution, chaired by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and France next week, and looks forward to it being an opportunity to reach concrete results and clear international commitments, and to be the main step on the road to full recognition of the state of Palestine's membership in the United Nations. In closing, Mr. President, the state of Qatar reiterates its principled and firm position in support of achieving a just and sustainable settlement of the Palestinian question based on the resolutions of international legitimacy and safeguarding the inalienable rights and legitimate aspirations of the Palestinian people, foremost of which is the establishment of an independent Palestinian state on the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. The state of Qatar will not spare any effort to pave the way and support efforts towards this end. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Qatar and now give the floor to the representative of the Philippines.
Thank you, Mr. President. The Philippines thanks you and Pakistan for the opportunity to address the Security Council on one of the longest, most intractable, and deeply rooted crises in our world. Mr. President, the Security Council has a responsibility to uphold the principles of the United Nations Charter, to ensure the implementation of its own resolutions, and to promote a political horizon for peace in the Middle East. With thousands of Filipinos working and living in the Middle East, the Philippines remains deeply concerned about the situation on the ground today. In this regard, the Philippines would like to reiterate the following. First, we support a complete and permanent ceasefire in Gaza. A ceasefire is both a political necessity and a moral obligation. It is the only way to halt the bloodshed, allow the delivery of urgent humanitarian assistance, and create space for diplomacy. Without a ceasefire, we are condemning innocent lives to further suffering and fueling instability that could spill far beyond the borders of Gaza. Second, we must call unequivocally for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. Holding civilians, men, women, children, the elderly, in captivity is a flagrant violation of international humanitarian law. Their families live in anguish, unsure of the fate of their loved ones. Their release is not a negotiating point. It is a fundamental matter of humanity, an international legal obligation. Third, we must continue the delivery of humanitarian assistance for those affected by the conflict. The situation on the ground in Gaza is catastrophic. Thousands of civilians have lost their lives. Entire neighborhoods lie in ruins. Medical facilities are overwhelmed or destroyed. Food, water, and fuel are running out. The population is being pushed beyond the limits of human endurance without basic supplies and medicines to survive. Fourth, the Philippines firmly supports the two-state solution in accordance with international law and relevant UN resolutions. The two-state solution with Israel and Palestine living side by side in peace and harmony remains the most widely supported framework for peace and most viable and sustainable pathway to resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is endorsed by numerous UN resolutions and the overwhelming majority of the international community. However, we must emphasize that security cannot be achieved through the use of force or unilateral measures. It can only be realized through a just and comprehensive resolution to the conflict. The path forward must be based on dialogue, not violence, on international law, not unilateral actions, on dignity, not despair. Fifth, we firmly support the acceptance of Palestine as a member of the United Nations. Mr. President, we continue to support the intensification and acceleration of international and regional diplomatic efforts aimed at achieving without delay a comprehensive, just, and lasting peace in the Middle East. We therefore commend and support the efforts by Saudi Arabia, Norway, and the European Union for spearheading the global alliance for the implementation of a Palestinian state and a two-state solution. We also appreciate Saudi Arabia and France for their leadership in convening the high-level international conference for the peaceful settlement of the question of Palestine and the implementation of the two-state solution next week. We also thank Egypt, Qatar, and the United States for their continuing mediation efforts on the ground to bring peace in the region. These are all significant steps for a comprehensive roadmap for lasting and enduring peace in the Middle East. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Philippines for the statement and now give the floor to the permanent representative of Brazil.
Mr. President, we welcome this debate on the situation in the Middle East, especially the question of Palestine, at a moment of unprecedented challenges to international law and to multilateralism. These are pillars of the international order that we must protect and promote. Without them, the world faces the real and serious risk of spiraling into chaos. The situation in Gaza is the most tragic example of such chaos. Chaos that ensues when actors decide to ignore internationally agreed rules and norms of international law and international humanitarian law. We witness in Gaza not merely a conflict, but a combination of man-made humanitarian catastrophe, unfolding war crimes that amount to genocide and moral collapse right under the watch of this organ. Brazil condemns in the strongest terms the continued deliberate attacks against civilians, humanitarian personnel, and UN staff. We call for an immediate and permanent ceasefire, the complete withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza, and the release of all hostages. We reiterate the urgent need for an unconditional lifting of all restrictions on the entry of humanitarian aid into Gaza. These restrictions have led to alarming levels of starvation, disease, and death with no clear end in sight. Israel, as the occupying power, has a legal and moral obligation to protect the civilian population under its responsibility. Accountability is also essential and urgent. Those responsible for violations of international law and international humanitarian law must be brought to justice. It is not only a matter of principle, it is a condition for lasting peace and the preservation of international order. The role of UNRWA is indispensable and irreplaceable in its 5 fields of operation. Attacks on the agency are attacks on the primary lifeline for millions of Palestinian refugees, and on the UN. On July 1st, Brazil assumed the presidency of UNRWA's Advisory Commission. In such capacity, we are committed to upholding the agency's mandate as well as advocating for continued political and financial support for its activities. The ICJ reaffirmed last year that Israel's occupation of Palestinian territory is unlawful and must be brought to an end. This was not a mere statement of fact and of law, but a strong call for action by all of us. Indeed, this decades-long history of violence and deprivation will only cease with the full implementation of the two-state solution, with an independent and viable state of Palestine living side by side with Israel in peace and security within the 1967 borders, which includes the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, with East Jerusalem as its capital. The high-level international conference on the two-state solution can be a key step in that direction. Brazil is fully engaged in its preparation as co-chair, alongside Senegal, of the Working Group on International Law and is fully committed to its success. In this context, we renew our call on all member states that have not yet recognized the State of Palestine to do so and to support its full membership in the UN. Mr. President, beyond Palestine, the Middle East faces increased tensions. Brazil expresses its grave concern regarding the recent military escalation in the region. We firmly condemn military attacks against safeguarded nuclear facilities in Iran, which violate the country's sovereignty and breach international law, while also posing unacceptable humanitarian risks to civilian populations and the environment. Brazil rejects any form of nuclear proliferation and defends the exclusive use of nuclear energy for peaceful purposes. In this context, we reiterate the importance of establishing a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East. It is our conviction that nuclear disarmament is the only way to ensure sustainable and enduring peace. We remain deeply concerned by the situation in Yemen, as well as by the repeated violations of the ceasefire in Lebanon and by the continued attacks against Syrian territory. Israel's actions in Syria can only aggravate instability in a context of high volatility. We reiterate the imperative of upholding international law and fully complying with the relevant United Nations resolutions in all circumstances. Mr. President, Brazil's commitment to peace and justice in the Middle East is unwavering. We stand ready to continue contributing to the success of the upcoming high-level international conference and to the realization of the two-state solution that will ultimately bring peace and stability to the whole region. Thank you.
Thank the representative of Brazil for the statement, and now give the floor to the representative of Indonesia.
Mr. President, I thank Pakistan for convening this meeting and for the briefers for their insights. Allow me to start by expressing Indonesia's profound sorrow on the tragic demise of Dr. Marwan Sultan, the director of Gaza's Indonesian hospital, who was killed along several of his family members by Israeli airstrikes early this month. Their demise adds to the long list of humanitarian worker casualties in Gaza who perished while defending humanity. It also reflects the alarming fact that since the Council's last open debate just 3 months ago, the situation in the Middle East has only deteriorated. Deterioration caused by a self-appointed sheriff in the region who, instead of bringing law and order, has unleashed further chaos by attacking its neighboring nations of Iran, Syria, and Lebanon. A self-appointed sheriff whose pattern of aggression is deeply linked to its persistent illegal actions in Palestine, where the humanitarian crisis in Gaza continues to soar, and the West Bank faces escalating violence and expansion of illegal settlements. How can this sheriff operate with blank check, enjoying both immunity and impunity? What will the Council do to exert its authority in maintaining international peace and security so that no state can act with impunity? Indonesia calls for 3 urgent actions. First, expectations are high that the Council can bring back multilateralism to the table. Just yesterday, the Council held an open debate that made it clear how most countries wanted to see the revival of multilateralism to end the might is right. The forthcoming high-level conference on the two-state solutions, convened under the auspices of the General Assembly, represents a watershed moment to bring back multilateralism in peaceful settlements of dispute. Indonesia looks forward to the successful convening of the high-level conference and is proud to serve as one of the working group co-chairs. Indonesia also continues to support various ongoing processes and deliberations under the ICJ, another example of multilateralism in action. With the General Assembly and ICJ actively engaged, the Council must not continue to stand in paralysis. Second, expectations are high that the Council's deliberation and decisions reflect the global conscience. The dire situation in Gaza is not only grossly inhumane, it is also a primary driver of escalating tensions across the Middle East. The Council must assert its control over the situation by bringing immediate, unconditional, and permanent ceasefire in Palestine. The indiscriminate violence, including mass casualties among aid seekers attempting to access food and supplies, must end now. Humanitarian aid must reach those in need without obstruction. Humanitarian workers must be able to operate in safety. UNRWA remains our sole legitimate hope. Its role is simply indispensable. Third, expectations are high that the Council can restore the sanctity of international law. The continued Israeli occupation of Palestine, its recent attacks on Iran and airstrikes in Syria are consequences of a collective failure to uphold the international law, perpetuating impunity and double standards. International law also forms the foundation of the two-state solution, which remain the only viable and internationally agreed framework that is critical for broader regional peace and stability. Amid the climate of stagnation, ensuring that legal instruments serve their intended purpose is key to restore the Council's credibility. Mr. President, the ongoing failure to address the escalating regional situation starkly highlights the breakdown of the multilateral system. It should compel us to acknowledge that reform is not only necessary, but must be undertaken without delay. Indonesia is committed to contribute to this crucial effort towards a Security Council that rises to the challenge of its own mandate. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank the representative of Indonesia for the statement, and now give the floor to the permanent representative of Portugal.
Thank you, Mr. President. Since the last open debate and amidst the grim picture of the situation in Gaza and the West Bank, some important developments have taken place in the Middle East. Starting with some positive news, let me highlight the cessation of hostilities between Israel and Iran and the lifting of sanctions on Syria by the European Union and other important international actors. However, last week we have seen a worrying situation in Syria. We call on all parties to implement a ceasefire, avoid escalation, and to work constructively towards the stabilization of Syria with full respect for the rights of every community and of every state. In Lebanon, we reaffirm our support for the full implementation of the terms of the 27 November 2024 ceasefire agreement and Security Council Resolution 1701. Both Lebanese and Syrian peoples deserve peace and respect for their country's territorial integrity, unity, and sovereignty. In Gaza, let me start by expressing Portugal's profound concern about the humanitarian situation unfolding in the territory. Starvation rates among children hit their highest levels in June. 70% of essential medicines are out of stock, and 95% of households do not have access to adequate water, just to mention a few figures. Against this background, there have been daily reports of little shots fired at Palestinians waiting in line for humanitarian aid under the militarized humanitarian mechanism implemented in Gaza. We underline that even during wars, international law and international humanitarian law must be upheld by all parties, and the core principles for humanitarian action, humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence must be respected fully. The resumption of UN-led humanitarian operations in Gaza in line with the international humanitarian law is key. We condemn the taking of hostage by Hamas, and we demanded their immediate release. We also condemn the indiscriminate bombing of civilians and religious targets and infrastructures by Israel, including UN facilities. Protection of civilians, it's not optional, and we stress that as an occupying power, Israel has the obligation to ensure the safety of the occupied population. Mr. President, the war in Gaza aggravates the suffering of innocent Palestinian civilians and contributes for negative political context in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, where Israel has been expanding military operations amid reports of settler violence and killing, expansion of illegal settlements, and demolition of Palestinian properties. Once again, Portugal reiterates its support to UNRWA and its role in stabilizing the situation on the ground. We welcome the report issued by the head of the strategic assessment of the agency, Ian Martin. UNRWA represents part and parcel of the international community's commitment to the two-state solution, and its mandate remains valid. Therefore, Portugal joins 27 states appealing this week, calling for an immediate and permanent ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, to get hostages out, to resume unimpeded entry and distribution of humanitarian aid, and to break the cycle of violence. We reaffirm this appeal today before this Council. We reiterate our support of the mediators' efforts, namely Qatar, Egypt, and the United States, in facilitating the negotiation between the parties. Mr. President, now, more than ever, we need to revive a political process to implement a two-state solution with an independent and sovereignty state of Palestine living side by side with Israel in peace and security. That is the reason why Portugal welcomes the resumption of the high-level international conference for the peaceful settlement of the question of Palestine and the implementation of the two-state solution next week under the auspices of the GA. Portugal remains committed to the rule of law and international order based on rules, with the United Nations at the center. We will keep our consistent positions on every front, and will continue to strive for a just and peaceful solution to the Palestinian question, anchored on the relevant resolutions of the United Nations. I thank you.
I thank the representative of Portugal and give the floor to the representative of Uganda.
Mr. President, I'm honored to deliver this statement on behalf of the 121 member states of the non-aligned movement, NAM. I congratulate the Islamic Republic of Pakistan upon its accession to the presidency of the Security Council this month, and express appreciation for granting NAM the opportunity to present its position on the question of Palestine. NAM reaffirms its long-standing, common, and principled position on the question of Palestine, and is deeply concerned about the implications of this ongoing injustice, most critically, the devastating conflict and unprecedented humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza on the Palestinian people. NAM calls for a just solution to this historic injustice and for peace and security in the region. There has been no reprieve to the grave situation in Palestine, and the conflict continues to intensify, worsening the catastrophic humanitarian situation not only in Gaza but also throughout the rest of the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, where Israeli military raids and settler violence and terror have dramatically risen. The member states of the United Nations conferred on the Security Council the primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security in accordance with Article 12 and 24 of the Charter. The Security Council must uphold its mandate to maintain international peace and security and must act to implement its own resolutions. The question of Palestine cannot be an exception to international law and to the authority of this Council. We call on the Security Council to uphold its responsibilities and to act forthwith for the full implementation of all its resolutions pertaining to the question of Palestine, including its most recent resolutions 2334, 2016, 2712, 2022, 2720, 2023, 2728, 2024, and 2735, 2024. NAM regrets that despite all efforts, including those by member states of NAM caucus in the Security Council, that this august body continues to fall short in demanding an immediate, unconditional, permanent, and fully respected ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, and once again urges the Council to fulfill its primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security as provided for in the UN Charter, particularly by urgently demanding a ceasefire and acting with resolve to address this prolonged crisis. NAM condemns in the strongest terms all forms of violence, particularly Israel military attacks and Israel collective punishment against the Palestinian people as grave breaches of international law, including humanitarian and human rights law. The killing and injury of tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians in Gaza, the majority of whom are children and women, including medical personnel, humanitarian workers, and journalists, is an indictment to the mandate of the UN Security Council. NAM demands an immediate and complete cessation of all forms of armed hostilities, violent repression, and illegal Israeli policies and practices against Palestinian people and other nations in the region. The non-aligned movement expresses its appreciation to the role played by the Arab Republic of Egypt and the State of Qatar, both members of our movement, in securing the ceasefire agreement that went into effect on 19th January 2025, and their ongoing efforts aimed at achieving an immediate and permanent ceasefire. Accordingly, NAM calls for the release and exchange of hostages and Palestinians detained in Israeli prisons, the return of Palestinian civilians to their homes and neighborhoods in all areas of Gaza, and the safe and effective distribution of sufficient humanitarian assistance throughout the Gaza Strip to all Palestinian civilians who need it, including medical needs. NAM members also condemn the ongoing forced starvation and repeated forced displacement of the civilian population throughout Gaza, and demands a halt to all such illegal and inhuman actions, and calls for protection of the Palestinian people in accordance with international humanitarian law. NAM expresses its strong support for the Arab Islamic plan for early recovery, reconstruction, and development of Gaza, which was presented by the Arab Republic of Egypt in full coordination with the State of Palestine and endorsed by both Arab League and Organization of Islamic Cooperation. NAM urges member states, international organizations, and donors to provide the necessary political and financial support to the plan, and also commends Egypt's efforts to convene an international conference for this objective. The non-aligned movement condemns the daily Israeli violations of the cessation of hostilities announcement since its entry into force in November 27, 2024, by committing thousands of aerial and territorial violations against Lebanon and launching raids claiming the lives and wounding hundreds of victims. NAM condemns the continued Israeli occupation of 5 border positions in southern Lebanon, in addition to the establishment of 2 buffer zones within the Lebanese territory, which prevents the full deployment of the Lebanese army south of the Litani River and restricts the freedom of movement of UNIFIL peacekeepers and deny their access to some of their border positions, which constitutes a flagrant violation of Lebanon's sovereignty and of Resolution 1701/2016, and a blatant breach of the cessation of hostilities announcement. NAM calls on the Security Council to assume its responsibilities and to force Israel to withdraw from all Lebanese occupied territories immediately, fully, and unconditionally. Furthermore, NAM commends the progressing deployment of the Lebanese armed forces in the southern Litani region and the significant progress achieved in confining weapons and expanding state authority in this region and across Lebanon. NAM calls on the friendly nations to provide the necessary support to enhance the capabilities of Lebanese security forces and to assist in the reconstruction efforts. NAM reaffirms its full support for Lebanon's security, stability, and sovereignty. NAM stresses that establishing peace in the Middle East requires Israel's withdrawal from all occupied Arab territories, including occupied Syrian Arab Golan, and implementing relevant United Nations resolutions, most notably Security Council Resolution 242 of 1967 and 338, 1973, and 497, 1981, which reaffirm that the acquisition of territory by force is inadmissible in accordance with the Charter of the United Nations and the principles of international law, and that the Israeli decision to impose its laws, jurisdiction, and administration in the occupied Syrian Golan is null and void and without international legal effect. NAM condemns the Israeli incursions that took place in the Syrian territories since 8 December 2024 in a flagrant violation of international law, UN Charter and 1974 disengagement agreement, and calls on the Security Council to exert pressure on Israel to fully withdraw from all Syrian territories. NAM condemns the repeated Israeli attacks against the Syrian Arab Republic as they constitute a clear aggression against a sovereign state and a flagrant violation of the provisions of international law and the Charter of the United Nations. The non-aligned movement, Mr. President, once again condemns and denounces in the strongest possible terms the wanton and provoked and premeditated attacks started on 13th June 2025 against the sovereign and territorial integrity of the Islamic Republic of Iran, in particular those that targeted peaceful nuclear facilities under IAEA safeguards, resulted in damage that posed significant risks of radioactivity material release, constituting grave threats to civilian populations and the environment. In addition, strikes launched by Israel against several locations in Israel, including densely populated civilian areas, reportedly caused the death of approximately 1,000 individuals, injured thousands more, including women and children, and damaged civilian infrastructure. NAM stresses that these acts of aggression represent flagrant violations of international law and the Charter of the United Nations, particularly Article 2.4, which prohibits the threat or use of force against territorial integrity of any state. The non-aligned movement welcomes the reconvening of the postponed high-level international conference on the two-state solution as a reaffirmation of the unwavering international commitment to a just and peaceful settlement of the question of Palestine. The movement calls for the necessary coordination and cooperation among all states to advance the conference's objectives, to mobilize international efforts at the political, economic, financial, and security levels, and to foster momentum by building on a national, regional, and international initiatives aimed at achieving a just, lasting, and comprehensive peace for the Palestinian people. The non-aligned movement calls on the United Nations Security Council to urgently recommend the admission of Palestine as a full member of the United Nations in respect of the right of the Palestinian people to self-determination and relevant United Nations resolutions as a bold and long overdue commitment to lasting peace in the Middle East. NAM also calls on the Council to act forthwith to implement its many resolutions, demanding a halt to Israel's illegal settlement campaign in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, by which Israel continues to colonize the Palestinian land and to destroy the two-state solution. Now member states once again reiterate their call for the continued provision of the needed humanitarian and socio-economic assistance to the Palestinian people, including the Palestine refugees. The movement reaffirms the continued indispensability of the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees, the Near East, UNRWA, along with the other UN agencies and international organizations in the provision of urgently needed humanitarian assistance in line with international standards, and urges the international community to support the agency in all ways, including with sufficient and predictable funding. NAM rejects all attempts by Israel to undermine UNRWA by creating illegitimate parallel agencies as a threat to multilateralism and UN General Assembly mandate to provide humanitarian assistance. Mr. President, in conclusion, the movement seizes its opportunity to reiterate its call for collective international efforts to uphold international law, to bring an end to this historic and grave injustice. Now member states reaffirm their commitment to promoting a just, lasting, comprehensive, and peaceful solution to the question of Palestine in all its aspects, including for the plight of the Palestine refugees, and reaffirm their support for the Palestinian people in their struggle to achieve justice and fulfill their inalienable rights and legitimate national aspirations, including self-determination, freedom, and independence in their sovereign and independent state of Palestine, with East Jerusalem as its capital. NAM calls on all member states to uphold the obligations in accordance with international law, the relevant resolutions and the rulings of the International Court of Justice, ICJ, and to undertake tangible actions, including urgent measures of accountability to bring an end to this prolonged and tragic injustice, to end the illegal Israeli occupation, and to assist the Palestinian people to finally realize their rights. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank the representative of Uganda for the statement on behalf of the non-aligned movement. And now I'll give the floor to the permanent representative of Turkey.
Mr. President, I have the honor to deliver this statement on behalf of the group of member states of the OIC, Organization of Islamic Cooperation, in my capacity as chair of the group. Mr. President, distinguished members of the Council, at the outset, I would like to express our appreciation to the Islamic Republic of Pakistan for convening this open debate and for the comprehensive briefings. It is regrettable that the glimmers of hope which followed the recent negotiations and proximity talks on a permanent ceasefire in Gaza have not produced immediate results, thereby leaving the Palestinian people, especially in Gaza, to face the continuing horrors of this illegal occupation, including the most excruciating pains of starvation and deprivation. With each passing day, more innocent lives are lost as the people of Gaza struggle to survive under unbearable and life-threatening conditions. Records show that the death toll among the civilian population in Gaza, in Palestine, has continued to rise, numbering above 58,000 children, women, and men killed by Israel, the occupying power in Gaza, while more than 142,000 persons have been injured, most of them suffering lifelong disabilities, and more than 1,000 Palestinians killed and over 10,000 injured in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem by the Israeli occupying forces and settlers. The OIC group reiterates its strong condemnation on the escalation of the crimes, including genocide, forced displacement, starvation, and destruction perpetrated by the Israeli occupation in the Gaza Strip. This includes the recent barbaric massacres, including that perpetrated on June 30th, which resulted in the deaths of more than 85 martyrs and left hundreds wounded. OIC regards these actions as war crimes and crimes against humanity. This is in addition to attacks by the Israeli occupation forces on UNRWA schools and tent encampments sheltering the displaced, medical centers, and on humanitarian and medical personnel and journalists, in which civilians, including children, continue to be ruthlessly targeted, killed, and injured. Furthermore, we echo the OIC General Secretariat's concerns about the escalating Israeli attacks and the organized violence carried out by extremist settlers in the West Bank. This includes storming cities, establishing military checkpoints, targeting refugee camps, attacking civilians, displacing tens of thousands of citizens, and destroying homes and infrastructure. Furthermore, there continue to be incursions into the blessed Al-Aqsa Mosque, where Palestinians are being denied access in clear violation of international law and relevant UN resolutions. In this regard, the OIC calls for the respect of the historic status quo of the holy sites in Jerusalem. Continuation of all these crimes by Israel as the occupying power, as it violently entrenches its illegal occupation and continues to pursue the colonization and annexation of the Palestinian territory, while driving the Palestinian people from their homes and off their lands, compels the OIC to once again call for urgent action by the Security Council to ensure protection of the Palestinian people in accordance with international law and relevant UN resolutions of this Council, especially concerning the protection of civilians in armed conflict. Mr. President, in the midst of this desperate situation, Israeli military attacks on Gaza have continued unabated, while the people of Gaza are barred from returning to their homes. This calculated strategy, aimed at forcibly displacing the indigenous Palestinian civilian population of Gaza, represents an unprovoked violation of fundamental human rights and all norms of international law and international humanitarian law. Worse still, these actions are taking place in spite of the explicit provisions of the Security Council Resolution 2735, which calls, among other issues, for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and an unhindered flow of humanitarian relief assistance to the besieged Palestinian people in Gaza. In this regard, OIC expresses its unwavering support for the United Nations Relief and Works Agency, UNRWA, which continues to play an irreplaceable role in providing services to Palestinian refugees against all odds. We therefore call on the international community to continue their support to UNRWA, both politically and financially, and to ensure it is able to uphold its General Assembly mandate and operate unhindered in the face of worsening humanitarian situation in the occupied Palestinian territory, including Al-Quds al-Sharif, and continue its support to Palestinian refugees throughout the region and promote regional stability pending the realization of a just and lasting solution to the Palestinian question. In the same vein, the OIC group reaffirms its firm rejection of all illegal measures taken by Israel at undermining the mandate, operations, and continued existence of UNRWA. Mr. President, at this juncture, we urge the Council to act for the full implementation of its relevant resolutions and to support the full implementation of the resolutions of the General Assembly in its 10th Emergency Special Session, including Resolution ES-10/24 of 18 September 2024, which approved a pathway to the immediate termination of the Israeli occupation of the Palestinian territory. It is our fervent hope that this Council will draw inspiration from the historic advisory opinion of the International Court of Justice of 19 July 2024 by pronouncing on all issues, including the definitive halt to the ongoing carnage in Gaza and elsewhere in the occupied Palestinian territory, and an end to the illegal Israeli occupation in its entirety. To this end, the Council is once again invited to assume its primary responsibility for the maintenance of international peace and security at this very crucial period in the history of the protracted Middle East crisis. Furthermore, OIC encourages and commends the continuous efforts of the governments of Egypt, Qatar, and the United States to ensure that the ceasefire in Gaza, which entered into force on 19 January this year, is restored and leads to a permanent ceasefire. The OIC group calls on this Council to support the ongoing negotiations for restoration of the ceasefire and implementation of all its phases towards a permanent ceasefire. To this end, we reaffirm the importance of the forthcoming convening of the United Nations High-Level Conference on the peaceful settlement of the question of Palestine and the implementation of the two-state solution and relevant UN resolutions under the co-chairmanship of the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Republic of France. We support as well rescheduled resumption of the various working groups established pursuant to the conference and call on UN member states to participate actively in the rescheduled conference on 28 to 30 July next week to ensure full international mobilization in support of the conference's urgent objectives. Similarly, we highly appreciate the efforts undertaken within the framework of the Global Alliance for the Implementation of the Two-State Solution initiated by the OIC, LAC Contact Group, European Union, and Norway, League of Arabs. In this regard, OIC Group expresses its support to the Arab Islamic Plan for Early Recovery, Reconstruction, and Development in Gaza. OIC Group commends Egypt's efforts to convene an international conference in this context and urges international community to support politically and financially the Arab Islamic Plan, which underscores feasibility of reconstructing Gaza Strip without displacing the Palestinian people and calls upon the member states and the international donors to participate actively in the conference that Egypt plans to host. To this end, we call on the international community to act now towards enforcing an immediate, permanent, and comprehensive ceasefire, lift the blockade on Gaza, guarantee the unimpeded delivery of humanitarian aid, and provide meaningful protection to the Palestinian people. In the final analysis, we reaffirm our unwavering commitment to a just and lasting peace that ensures realization of the inalienable right of the Palestinian people to self-determination and the independence and sovereignty of the State of Palestine based on the pre-1967 borders with East Jerusalem as its capital. We stand firmly behind the long-held position of the OIC, grounded in international law and relevant UN resolutions, which supports the Palestinian people's right to self-determination and the right of the Palestinian refugees to return. Mr. President, OIC Group reiterates its full solidarity with the people and government of the Islamic Republic of Iran in the wake of the Israeli attacks, which commenced on 13 June this year. While condemning in strongest terms these Israeli heinous attacks, we reaffirm provision of the United Nations Security Council Resolution 487, dated 1981, which strongly condemned the military attack by Israel on nuclear installations in another country then. In this context, we reaffirm the importance of the establishment of a nuclear weapon-free zone in the Middle East and for Israel to place its nuclear facilities under the comprehensive safeguards regime of IAEA. In the same vein, OIC Group strongly condemns the continued Israeli aggression against sovereignty and territory of the Syrian Arab Republic, which constitutes a flagrant violation of the disengagement agreement signed between Syria and Israel in 1974. We hereby express our support for the legitimate right of the Syrian government to self-defense against the Israeli aggression and stress the need for the international community to assume its role in face of the ongoing Israeli violations on Syrian territory, including enforcement of international accountability mechanisms. OIC Group condemns the daily Israeli violation of the cessation of the hostilities announcement since its entry into force on November 27, 2024, by committing thousands of aerial and territorial violations against Lebanon and launching raids, claiming the lives and wounding hundreds. This group condemns continued Israeli occupation of 5 border positions in southern Lebanon, in addition to the establishment of 2 buffer zones within the Lebanese territory, which prevents full deployment of the Lebanese army south of the Litani River and restricts freedom of movement of UNIFIL peacekeepers and deny their access to some of their border positions, and which constitutes a flagrant violation of Lebanese sovereignty and of Resolution 1701, dated 2006, and a belated breach of the cessation of hostilities announcement. OIC Group calls on the Security Council to assume its responsibilities to force Israel to withdraw from all Lebanese occupied territories immediately, fully, and unconditionally. Furthermore, the group commends the progressing deployment of the Lebanese armed forces in the South Litani region and the significant progress achieved in confining weapons and expanding state authority in this region and across Lebanon. OIC Group calls on friendly nations to provide the necessary support to enhance capabilities of Lebanese security forces and to assist in reconstruction efforts. The group reaffirms its full support for Lebanese security, stability, and territorial integrity. Mr. President, now I would like to make the following statement in my national capacity in a very compact way. Aligning with the OIC statement, we once again underline that recognition of the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people and establishment of an independent state of Palestine with East Jerusalem as its capital are essential for ensuring lasting peace and stability in the Middle East. In this regard, we welcome the announcement that the high-level international conference for the peaceful settlement of the question of Palestine will be held in New York next week. We commend the leadership of Saudi Arabia and France in advancing this vital initiative. As a roundtable co-chair of the conference, Turkey urges all member states to seize the opportunity to reinvigorate collective efforts toward a just, comprehensive, and lasting peace. To this end, we stress the importance of increasing international recognition of the State of Palestine and ensuring its full membership in the United Nations as critical steps towards implementing the two-state solution. Mr. President, in conclusion, we call on this Council to act with unity, determination, and moral clarity to end suffering in Gaza, to uphold the principles of the United Nations Charter. We reiterate urgent calls for an immediate and sustained ceasefire in Gaza, unhindered humanitarian access in accordance with the international law, and a renewed and urgent commitment to the two-state solution. We trust the upcoming high-level conference will serve as a catalyst for mobilizing the necessary momentum, resources, and political will to achieve these goals. Turkey stands ready to support the Palestinian people and all efforts to achieve a political solution based on the two-state vision and pre-1967 borders with East Jerusalem as the capital of an independent, sovereign, and geographically contiguous state of Palestine. Mr. President, the conference is approaching. It is next week. I reiterate our call again as chair of the working group on preserving the two-state solution, all members of the United Nations, but especially members of this council, to contribute to the success of the conference by recognizing the state of Palestine, to take this historic opportunity. States have tools to combat such lawlessness and to serve the justice as was verdicted by the ICJ. So this is the historic opportunity. I hope all council members will take this opportunity to contribute to the success of the conference. Thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of Turkey for the statements on behalf of the OIC and in his national capacity. And I now give the floor to the permanent representative of Kazakhstan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I warmly commend the Pakistani presidency for its stewardship of this important debate and your own thoughtful leadership of the Security Council during these months. I also thank ASG Khaled Kiari for his insightful briefing today. Kazakhstan expresses its deep concern over the continued escalation of violence and humanitarian suffering in the Middle East, particularly in Gaza and the West Bank. We join others in calling for immediate and unconditional ceasefire and the protection of civilians in full accordance with the international humanitarian and human rights law. We also support the immediate release of all hostages and unpitted humanitarian access and pay tribute to the courage of medical and relief personnel working under the dire conditions. We underscore the essential role of UNRWA in supporting Palestinian refugees and the urgent need for sustained and predictable support to ensure the continuity of its mandate. The human toll of the conflict has been tragic. At this critical juncture, the restoration of peace must now be matched by a genuine multilateral momentum of political solutions and not military action, as well as renewed commitment to justice, accountability, and reconciliation. Kazakhstan reaffirms its long-standing position for the two-state solution as the only viable path to resolving the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. We envision Israel and Palestine coexisting in peace and security within internationally recognized borders based on the pre-1967 lines and with East Jerusalem as the capital of the state of Palestine. Kazakhstan welcomes the upcoming high-level conference on the two-state solution and commends the pivotal and indispensable role played by France and Kingdom of Saudi Arabia in galvanizing political will, forging consensus, and reactivating the peace process. We call for the outcomes of the conference to be fully integrated into the deliberations and resolutions of the United Nations Security Council to establish a unified and action-oriented approach. Beyond the Israeli-Palestinian issue, Kazakhstan draws attention to the urgent necessity of reinvigorated multilateral attention to other protracted crises in the Middle East to ensure regional and global stability. We call for support to the UN-led efforts for inclusive political settlements in Yemen, sustainable peace in Syria, and Lebanon's sovereignty, security, and stability through restored governance and economic reforms. Mr. President, Kazakhstan remains convinced that a comprehensive collective approach with confidence-building measures rooted in international law and the UN Charter, the relevant Security Council resolutions, is essential to eliminate the root causes of conflict, de-escalate tensions, and restore peace and stability in the Middle East. In these testing times, let us reaffirm the Council's relevance to foster a just, inclusive, and durable peace across the region. I thank you.
Of Kazakhstan for the statement, and now give the floor to the permanent representative of India.
Mr. President, I thank you for convening today's quarterly open debate. Today's meeting takes place against the backdrop of a persisting humanitarian crisis in Gaza. Intermittent pauses in hostilities are not enough to address the scale of humanitarian challenges confronting the people who grapple daily with acute shortages of food and fuel, inadequate medical services, and lack of access to education. The health and education situation is particularly troubling. The WHO estimates that around 95% of all hospitals in Gaza are damaged or destroyed. The Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights reports that more than 650,000 children have had no schooling for over 20 months. The way ahead is clear, and India has been consistent in this regard. The ongoing human suffering must not be allowed to continue. Humanitarian assistance needs to be facilitated in a safe, sustained, and timely manner. There is no substitute to peace. A ceasefire must be put in place. All hostages must be released. Dialogue and diplomacy remain the only viable paths to achieving these objectives. There are no other fixes or solutions. India shares historic and strong ties with our Palestinian brothers and sisters. We have always stood by them, and our commitment towards the Palestinian cause is unwavering. We were the first non-Arab country to recognize the state of Palestine. We support the Palestinian people in various ways, directly and through our support to other organizations such as UNRWA. Our endeavor is to make a tangible impact on the daily lives of the Palestinians by implementing projects in diverse sectors. India is currently implementing projects valued at more than $40 million. Mr. President, India reiterates that the pathway to enduring peace is rooted in a two-state solution, one that establishes a sovereign, viable, and independent state of Palestine within recognized and mutually agreed borders, living side by side with Israel in peace. India takes note of the high-level international conference on the implementation of a two-state solution scheduled next week. While engaging in a forward-leaning and constructive manner, it's our hope that this conference would pave the way for concrete steps towards achieving a two-state solution. Mr. President, in conclusion, India underscores its readiness to contribute to efforts that are aimed at shaping a political horizon that restores hope for the Palestinians and achieving sustained peace in the Middle East. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank the Permanent Representative of India for the statement, and now give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Morocco.
شكرا سيدي الرئيس. أود في البداية أن أهنئكم على عقد هذا الاجتماع الذي ترأسه نائب رئيس الوزراء ووزير خارجية جمهورية باكستان الإسلامية معالي السيد محمد إسحاق دار. كما أشكر السيد خالد خياري مساعد الأمين العام للأمم المتحدة لشؤون الشرق الأوسط وآسيا والمحيط الهادئ على إحاطته القيمة. سيد الرئيس، يشهد قطاع غزة منذ ما يقارب العامين مأساة إنسانية غير مسبوقة تزداد قتامتها يوما بعد يوم وراح ضحيتها أعداد مهولة من المدنيين غالبيتهم من النساء والأطفال إلى جانب تدمير واسع النطاق ومنع وصول الغذاء والماء والدواء والمساعدات الإنسانية لغاية انتهاك القوانين الدولية والقيم الإنسانية وأمام الوضع المقلق الذي تعيشه المنطقة بعد انهيار اتفاق وقت
In light of the worrisome situation after the failure of the ceasefire in the Gaza Strip, His Majesty Mohammed VI, may God protect him, launched a call for the 34th summit that was organized in the Sister Republic of Iraq, and his message was that firstly the immediate cessation of military activities and the return to the negotiating table to relaunch the truce agreement in order to ensure a final ceasefire agreement. Secondly, bringing an end to the Israeli military aggression against the West Bank, particularly the destruction of homes, the expulsion of the inhabitants, and thirdly, guarantee the pursuit of humanitarian aid, particularly medical and food products towards Gaza, and non-obstruction under any pretext. 4, preserve the role of UNRWA and provide it with the necessary support to be able to carry out its mandate as entrusted by the international community for the benefit of civilians. 5, implement a comprehensive roadmap to launch a reconstruction plan adopted by the last extraordinary Arab summit in Cairo, prevent the expulsion of inhabitants under the administration of the Palestinian Authority under Arab and international control, end quote. The Council of the League met on the 22nd of July 2025 and underscored the need to impose the entry of humanitarian convoys and to allow the access of international organizations into Gaza, as well as to guarantee the safety of their personnel so that they can fully carry out their role. Mr. President, the ongoing unilateral Israeli measures in violation of international law in Al-Quds al-Sharif exacerbates conflicts, extremism, and is driving escalation, tension, and violence, which is hampering efforts towards further calm. His Majesty Mohammed VI, in his capacity as President of the Al-Quds Committee, which is a part of the OIC, is closely following and with great interest following the developments of the Palestinian question and deplores all possible efforts and is using all possible tools to defend the holy sites, principally Al-Quds al-Sharif, through political and diplomatic work and work on the ground. This is being undertaken by the Beit Mal Al-Quds agency, the section of the Al-Quds Committee that operates on the ground through specific plans and projects to protect the civilizational and holy spirit of the holy city, and to improve the living conditions of the inhabitants, to support their resilience and ensure that they can continue to reside in Al-Quds. President, the Kingdom of Morocco submits its unchanged position on the Palestinian question. This is the key to peace and stability in the Middle East in the context of an internationally agreed agreement and for an independent Palestinian state behind the 4th of June 1967 borders, with East Jerusalem as its capital, of which the Gaza Strip is an integral part. The Kingdom of Morocco believes that the two-state solution is the very foundation for the achievement of continued stability in the region. Despite a series of crises and challenges, this solution remains the only realistic outlook for the peaceful, comprehensive settlement of the conflict. The two-state solution is a solution where there are only winners, no losers. Palestinians would acquire their freedom and dignity and independence, and Israelis would guarantee their security, stability, and the entire region would garner promising opportunities for development and progress. In this context, states participating in the fifth meeting that was held in Rabat in last May, organized together between the Kingdom of Morocco and the Netherlands, reaffirmed the need to step up collective efforts to ensure appropriate conditions for the settlement on a basis of two states living side by side in peace and stability. In conclusion, I wish to welcome the efforts made by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Republic of France for the joint presidency of the International High-Level Conference for the implementation of the two-state solution in New York between the 28th and the 30th of July this year. We hope that this conference will lead to crucial results for the Palestinian question and will be able to contribute to reaching a just, lasting peace in the region. Thank you very much.
I thank the permanent representative of Morocco for the statement, and now give the floor to the representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela.
Señor Presidente, muchas gracias. La
Mr.
República
President, thank you very
Bolivariana de
much. The
Venezuela
Bolivarian
tiene el
Republic
honor
of
de hacer
Venezuela
uso de la
has the honor
palabra
to
en
take the
nombre
floor on
del
behalf
Grupo de
of the
Amigos en
group of friends in
Defensa de
defense
la
of the
Carta de
Charter of
las
the
Naciones
United
Unidas,
Nations,
cuyos Estados miembros
whose member
subrayan que la
states
situación en el
underscore that the
territorio palestino
situation in
ocupado,
the occupied Palestinian
particularmente en la
territory,
franja de
particularly in
Gaza,
the
ha
Gaza
alcanzado
Strip, has
proporciones
reached unimaginable
inimaginables,
proportions,
con asaltos diarios por
with
parte de
daily
Israel, la
assaults by
potencia
Israel,
ocupante,
the
que
occupying
incluyen el
power,
ataque
that include
deliberado,
the
entre
deliberate
otros, a
targeting, among
hospitales,
others,
escuelas,
of hospitals,
refugios,
schools,
infraestructuras
shelters,
críticas,
critical
periodistas y
infrastructure,
trabajadores
journalists, and
humanitarios.
aid workers.
Desde el último debate abierto
Since
trimestral,
the
las
last
fuerzas de
quarterly open
ocupación
debate,
israelíes solo han
the
intensificado su
Israeli
brutal
occupying
campaña
forces
militar
have
contra
only
el pueblo
escalated
palestino.
their brutal
Y
military
es que de
campaign
hecho hoy
against the
estamos siendo
Palestinian
testigos de la
people.
comisión de
We
actos
are
sistemáticos y
witnessing
deliberados
systematic and deliberate
destinados a
acts intended to
destruir total o
destroy in whole
parcialmente
or in
a un
part
pueblo
a
desposeído,
people who
desplazado por la
have been
fuerza y
dispossessed, forcibly
deshumanizado
displaced,
durante
and
décadas.
dehumanized for
Así
decades.
lo demuestra, entre otras cosas,
This is proven,
un
among other
conjunto de
things,
crudas
by
cifras.
stark figures. To put this in perspective, since the breach of the ceasefire in March, more than 6,400 Palestinians have been killed in Gaza, including women and children, bringing the total death toll since October 2023 to over 58,000. These are not statistics, they are lives that have been extinguished by Israel, the occupying power, which continues to operate with impunity and with blatant disregard for international law. And so we're forced to ask, what can be expected in 3 months' time when we meet again in this chamber on the eve of the second anniversary of this ongoing tragedy? Now, Mr. President, in parallel, the situation in the rest of the occupied Palestinian territory, particularly in the West Bank, is not much different, as is evidenced by the ongoing calculated destruction of homes and infrastructure and the forced displacement of entire communities in a clear attempt to alter the demographic or territorial character of the state of Palestine as part of the illegal occupations, blatant and illegal schemes to colonize and annex the Palestinian land. In Masafa Jatta, for instance, Israel is preparing to demolish 12 Palestinian villages under false military pretext, threatening thousands with forced transfer, while also planning to further expand its illegal settlements. Such acts are part of a broader and more long-standing policy aimed at creating facts on the ground, which violates inter alia Security Council Resolution 2334 and the Fourth Geneva Convention. This illegal settlement campaign has further been accompanied by a growing wave of Israeli settler violence, resulting in the killing of civilians, including children, and destruction of property, all with a clear aim of driving the Palestinian people off their land. Mr. President, the humanitarian situation on the ground is, to say the least, catastrophic and absolutely unsustainable. In this context, we cannot but stress once again the importance of urgently achieving an immediate, unconditional, permanent, and fully respected ceasefire, both in Gaza and in other areas under attack by the occupying power, as well as the need to take urgent steps to halt the provision or transfer of arms, munitions, and related equipment to Israel in all cases where there are reasonable grounds to suspect that they might be used in the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, as is stipulated in General Assembly Resolution ES 1024. We cannot overemphasize this. It is of utmost importance for creating the conditions that are needed on the ground to facilitate the work of humanitarian actors in providing rapid and unhindered support and assistance to Palestinian civilians in desperate need today, in a consistent and safe manner and at scale. We also call for the release of all hostages and detainees, including the thousands of Palestinians who for years have been held captive in Israeli prisons and detention centers. Mr. President, along these same lines, we condemn in the strongest terms the creation of the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. This is a scheme that has aimed to replace legitimate humanitarian access, including by the UN and, above all, by UNRWA, with a militarized system of deprivation. This system has become a death trap in which starving, displaced, and desperate civilians deprived of food, water, and all other essentials of life are being lured to so-called distribution points only to be targeted by live fire from Israeli forces and private contractors who have thus far killed over 600 Palestinians, including children, and injured thousands more. We have to say this clearly. This is not humanitarian aid. It is weaponized hunger. It is collective punishment. It is a grotesque distortion of international humanitarian principles, and it must end immediately. We reiterate in this regard our call for an end to ongoing efforts to dismantle UNRWA, a pillar of humanitarian relief and human rights protection for millions of refugees in Palestine. The obstruction of the UN's ability to operate, provide aid, and protect civilians is no more than a direct assault on the multilateral system and the Charter of the UN itself. Thus, we join the growing international calls for the full, unimpeded restoration of humanitarian access under UN leadership, including the work of UNRWA, whose work on the ground remains
fundamental in accordance with the General Assembly mandate. Similarly, we renew our support for the start of a major multi-year reconstruction plan for Gaza with international support swiftly mobilized based on the Arab and OIC Gaza Relief and Early Recovery Plan in full coordination with the State of Palestine. President, we also express our dismay at the unilateral decision of the U.S. government to impose hostile and punitive measures against Mr. Francesca Albanese, Special Rapporteur on the situation of human rights in the occupied Palestinian territory since 1967. We underscore that this latest attack of the U.S. government against Mr. Francesca Albanese not only compounds other concerning measures and actions taken by the occupying power in recent years, it remains in contempt of international law and continues to fail in implementing binding Security Council resolutions on the question of Palestine. And specifically, this should be understood more importantly as a part of a systematic joint campaign aimed at discrediting, intimidating, penalizing and targeting international officials who, under the auspices of the UN, exercise their legitimate mandated functions in relation to the question of Palestine. Therefore, we call for their immediate end. In this vein, we must also refer to another unlawful, irresponsible action of the U.S. government in recent weeks. That is, the airstrikes conducted on the 22nd of June this year in complicity with Israel against 3 peaceful Iranian nuclear facilities. This was, as we all know, preceded by a series of unprovoked and premeditated heinous attacks by Israel against the Islamic Republic of Iran since the 13th of June 2025. These attacks resulted in more than 1,000 innocent civilians' deaths while leaving many thousands of others wounded. We call for an immediate end to the threats of the use of force against Iran while reiterating the content of the special communiques issued by our briefing on the 14th and 23rd of June 2025 and cautioning of the direct implications on regional and international peace and security. Mr. President, all of this makes us emphasize once again the importance of redoubling international efforts to effectively and immediately advance towards a much-needed process of accountability for all war crimes committed by Israel against the peoples of Palestine, Lebanon, Iran, and other nationalities, in which it is hoped that relevant mechanisms of international justice will play a responsible role so as to bring an end to the prevailing cycle of impunity which has only served to embolden the occupying power to perpetuate over time their criminal policies and practices against the people of the region, most gravely against the Palestinian people for over 77 years since the onset of the Nakba. We further caution against the acquiescence and omission of the United Nations and the international community as a whole in the face of the occupying power's persistent contempt for international law, including its actions aimed at escalating tensions on the ground, as exemplified by its recurrent brutal attacks on the region. The failure to act against such gross violations of Israel will end up only further eroding the rule of law at the international level and weakening the credibility of the multilateral system, while at the same time normalizing its further commission of egregious crimes. In this context, it's important for all of us to be clear. What we are currently witnessing, particularly in Gaza, is not a security operation, but the dismantlement of an entire people's existence. It is a war not only against the Palestinian people, but against international law, against human dignity, and against the very tenets and aspirations enshrined in the UN Charter, which we, as signatories to that historic treaty, have pledged to defend. This brings us once again to reiterating the importance of ensuring that Security Council resolutions on the question of Palestine are both fully respected and implemented. Mr. President, before concluding, our group renews its firm support to the just Palestinian cause, as well as its unwavering solidarity with the Palestinian people in their ongoing struggle for the realization of their inalienable right to self-determination and freedom, including the independence of a sovereign and viable state of Palestine.
Palestine based on the pre-1967 borders and with East Jerusalem as its capital, on the basis of the two-state solution, and that also guarantees the right of return of the refugees of Palestine in line with relevant UN resolutions. Finally, let us say that we await with anticipation the International Conference on the Peaceful Settlement of the Question of Palestine and the implementation of the two-state solution to be held in the next few days in the General Assembly. And in this regard, we express our determination to participate actively in this urgent undertaking to preserve a political horizon and realize the long-deferred promise of a comprehensive, just, lasting peace for the Palestinian people and the region of the Middle East as a whole. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela for the statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Cuba.
Señor Presidente, apoyamos las intervenciones de Venezuela en nombre del Grupo de Amigos en Defensa de la Carta de las Naciones Unidas, Uganda en nombre del Movimiento de Países No Alineados y la que pronunciará Nicaragua en su condición de vicepresidente del Comité para el Ejercicio de los Derechos Inalienables del Pueblo palestino. Es vergonzoso que tras una larga secuencia de reuniones del Consejo de Seguridad sobre la situación en el Oriente Medio, se mantenga en curso el genocidio de Israel contra la población palestina. El irrestricto apoyo político, diplomático, militar y financiero de los Estados Unidos sigue garantizando total impunidad a la potencia ocupante. En el periodo desde el último debate abierto, Estados Unidos impidió por sexta ocasión desde la escalada de 2023 que este Consejo exigiera un alto al fuego inmediato, incondicional y permanente en Gaza. Mientras se mantiene la parálisis del Consejo de Seguridad, el mecanismo de Israel y Estados Unidos destinado a la supuesta entrega de ayuda humanitaria en Gaza se usa como un arma de guerra para asesinar a más palestinos. A lo anterior se suman los nuevos planes israelíes para desplazar a los sobrevivientes del genocidio en Gaza y someterlos a una política de apartheid bajo el falaz nombre de ciudad humanitaria. Ambos hechos corroboran la declarada intención de exterminar al pueblo palestino y seguir avanzando en la supresión de sus territorios. Al propio tiempo, el gobierno estadounidense impone medidas de presión y chantaje contra instituciones y funcionarios de organismos multilaterales para tratar de silenciar voces que denuncian la masacre, como la de Francesca Albanese, relatora especial sobre la situación de los derechos humanos en el territorio palestino ocupado desde 1967. Cisjordania, donde persiste la violencia y las prácticas coloniales, tampoco escapa a la barbarie israelí. Siguiendo el mismo patrón de impunidad, hemos observado nuevas agresiones de Israel contra el Líbano, Siria, Yemen y la República Islámica de Irán. La política para reconfigurar Oriente Medio por la fuerza viola flagrantemente el derecho internacional y la Carta de la ONU a la vista de todos y perpetúa el ciclo de violencia e inseguridad en la región. No es posible lograr la paz en Oriente Medio sin una solución amplia, justa y duradera a la cuestión palestina. Urge poner fin a la ocupación israelí sobre los territorios palestinos y todos los territorios árabes ocupados y materializar el derecho del pueblo palestino a disponer de un Estado independiente y soberano dentro de las fronteras anteriores a 1967, con Jerusalén Oriental como su capital y que garantice el derecho al retorno de los refugiados. No existen excusas para continuar postergando la admisión de Palestina como Estado miembro de pleno derecho de la ONU. Esperamos que la Conferencia Internacional de Alto Nivel para el Arreglo Pacífico de la Cuestión de Palestina y la implementación de la solución biestatal a celebrarse del 28 al 30 de julio contribuya a ese noble propósito y tome en cuenta las justas aspiraciones y demandas del pueblo palestino al que trasladamos el invariable apoyo y solidaridad de Cuba. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Cuba for the statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Jaime Hermida Castillo, Vice Chair of the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinian People.
Mr. President, first of all, receive our recognition from all the members of the committee. because of your leadership and determination. Members of the Security Council, Excellencies, colleagues, we commend Pakistan for its leadership of the Council and His Excellency Mr. Mohammad Ichardar, Deputy Prime Minister and Minister for Foreign Affairs, for convening this meeting. We appreciate the briefing by Assistant Secretary General Khaled Kiari. As today, 655 days of relentless carnage has ravaged the Gaza Strip. Since Israel broke the ceasefire on 18 March 2025, Gaza has plunged further into catastrophe at an unimaginable scale. The renewed military assault, alongside a reimposed blockade now past its 100th day, has devastated already fragile humanitarian conditions, now deteriorating faster than at any point in the past 20 months. The suffering unfolding before our eyes is more than just a humanitarian emergency. It has become our moral litmus test, and we are failing. The so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, introduced on 27 May, replaced 400 UN-operated aid points with only 4 militarized sites. This has become killing zone. Almost 1,000 Palestinians have been killed and at least 5,000 injured while attempting to access food and relief. Starving people are being shot in overcrowded areas where there is no safety, no shelter, and nothing left of human dignity. This is not humanitarian assistance, but a deliberate and calculated infliction of suffering in violation of international law and UN Resolution 2735. Israel's continued relentless and disproportionate military operation on Gaza has killed over 58,000 Palestinians and wounded 140,000, the majority of whom are children, women, and other vulnerable civilians, a staggering toll that reflects no statistic, but lives, entire families, and futures erased. We urge once more the Security Council to hear the cries of a defenseless people and act on the international community's deep concern. It must condemn Israel's strike on displaced civilians and those searching for food, and demand full, safe, and sustained aid, access for people long denied the basic of life. With growing alarm, many member states and humanitarian organizations now reject the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation as dangerous and ineffective, calling instead for a return to the trusted UN-led system. Israel's military strike on the 9th of July on 6 Palestinian children fetching water in Nuseirat came mere days after the country's formal listing in the Secretary General CAAC report of June 2025 for grave violation against children. The Palestinian people continue to be systematically targeted with no accountability, no protection, and no international action. This is not an accident. It is impunity, unmasked, and must be stopped. Meanwhile, in the occupied West Bank, Israeli military raids, settled violence, and systematic demolition have displaced entire communities, especially in refugee camps and in the Jordan Valley. As of the 9th of July, 958 Palestinians have been killed. These are not isolated incidents, but a systematic campaign to force Palestinians off their land and entrench this illegal occupation and its annexation schemes. We also condemn Israel's plans to forcibly transfer hundreds of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza into so-called humanitarian cities under its control, de facto mass concentration camps, as warned by the UNRWA Commission General and others, including a former Israeli leader. This latest forced displacement towards Rafah denied Palestinians their rights, dignity, and any future in their homeland. These are no security measures, but a demographic engineering strategy that we categorically condemn. The Security Council cannot continue to be silent and complicit in such large-scale forced displacement. Israeli action must be stopped and reversed immediately. The committee welcomed the June 25 report on the UN Special Rapporteur on the situation of the human rights in the Palestinian territory, which documents corporate and institutional complicity in sustaining this illegal occupation. However, 1 year after the July 2024 International Court of Justice advisory opinion ruling deeming Israel occupation unlawful, the Security Council inaction remained a great moral failure, enabling Israel impunity as death's soar. The humanitarian crisis worsened, and Gaza near total ruin. Furthermore, the committee expressed its deep concern regarding the recent decision by the government of the United States of America to impose punitive measures against the Special Rapporteur of the United Nations on the situation of human rights in the Palestinian territory occupied since 1967, Mr. Francesca Albanese. We underscore the necessity of Ms. Albanese to operate freely, independently, and without fear of retaliation in the pursuit of her critical mandate. Distinguished delegates, colleagues, the time to act is now. We call upon the Council to do what the international community demands: a permanent international supervised ceasefire in the occupied Palestinian territory, including Gaza. Israel must lift the Gaza blockade and restore full, safe humanitarian operation to the United Nations, including UNRWA, which maintain the largest capacity of all UN agencies on the ground and remain indispensable for the welfare of the Palestine refugee community and as a stabilizing presence in the region. The militarized aid system in Gaza must be dismantled. Israel must end all forms of forced displacement and guarantee the right of return for those uprooted from their homelands. The General Assembly, through Resolution ES 1024, has made its stance clear. Israel's illegal occupation must end. With less than 3 months to act on the resolution, we urge Israel to immediately halt all unlawful measures that entrench control and risk permanent annexation of the occupied Palestinian territory, including East Jerusalem, including a complete halt to all settlement activities and settler terror and encroachment on Palestinian communities, Today's Security Council debate presents a critical opportunity to reaffirm the global commitment to ending the occupation and ensuring accountability. We commend the co-chairs, Saudi Arabia and France, for the swift and truthful leadership in rescheduling the resumption of the high-level conference on the implementation of the two-state solution to 28-30 July 2025. As violation against Palestinians persists, the Security Council must seize this momentum to deliver a coordinated, urgent, unified, and concrete immediate action to end Israel's military onslaught and occupation, and to secure a just peace that ensures the rights of the Palestinian people, including to self-determination and the independence of the State of Palestine. We also urge the Security Council to align itself with the broad consensus expressed by the General Assembly and recommend the admission of the State of Palestine as a full member of the United Nations. The systematic decimation of the Palestinian people, the annexation of their land, and the erasure of their future are accelerating. The international community must act decisively and without delay. We must respond with meaningful, coordinated action. The Palestinian people's right to self-determination and the independence of the State of Palestine, with its Jerusalem as its capital, must be realized in line with international law and relevant UN resolution without any further delay. I thank you on behalf of the committee.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Almeida Castillo for his statement. I now give the floor to His Excellency Mr. Stavros Lambrinidis, Head of the Delegation of the European Union to the UN.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have the honor to speak on behalf of the European Union and its member states, the candidate countries North Macedonia, Montenegro, Ukraine, the Republic of Moldova, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and the EFTA country Iceland, as well as Andorra and San Marino, align themselves with this statement. Mr. President, the European Union remains strongly committed to peace, security, and stability in the Middle East. We welcome the recent cessation of hostilities between Israel and Iran. The EU has always been clear that Iran must never be allowed to acquire a nuclear weapon, and we urge Iran to comply with the legally binding nuclear safeguard obligations under the Non-Proliferation Treaty. In this context, we express our full support to the IAEA and Director General Grossi. The European Union will continue to contribute to all diplomatic efforts aimed at de-escalating tensions and reaching a lasting solution to the Iranian nuclear issue, which can only be achieved through negotiations. The EU calls for an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and the unconditional release of all hostages, leading to a permanent end to hostilities. The EU continues to fully support the mediators, the United States, Egypt, and Qatar. It deplores the dire humanitarian situation in Gaza, the unacceptable number of civilian casualties, and the levels of starvation. The EU calls on Israel to fully lift its blockade on Gaza, to allow immediate, unimpeded access and sustained distribution of humanitarian assistance at scale into and throughout Gaza, and to enable the UN and its agencies and humanitarian organizations to work independently and impartially to save lives and reduce suffering. Israel must fully comply with its obligations under international law, including international humanitarian law. The EU deplores the refusal of Hamas to hand over the remaining hostages. We stress the essential role of the UN and its agencies, notably UNRWA, which provides crucial support to the civilian population both in Gaza and the wider region. Mr. President, given the catastrophic humanitarian situation in the ground in Gaza, EU High Representative Kaja Kallas entered into a dialogue with Israeli authorities on the humanitarian situation. Following this dialogue between the EU and Israel, steps have been agreed by Israel to improve the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip. The European Union expects the immediate and full implementation of these steps. The EU strongly condemns the further escalation in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, following increased settler violence, the expansion of illegal settlements, Israel's military operation, and increased terrorist attacks against Israel. The EU will continue to work on further restrictive measures against extremist settlers and against entities and organizations that support them, as well as against Hamas. The European Council reaffirmed the EU's commitment to a lasting and sustainable peace based on the two-state solution, and we are ready to contribute to all efforts towards the solution and call on all parties to refrain from actions that undermine its viability. The EU will continue supporting the Palestinian Authority and its reform agenda. In this context, we look forward to the high-level international conference for the peaceful settlement of the question of Palestine and the implementation of the two-state solution, co-chaired by France and Saudi Arabia. With regard to Syria, the EU is committed to supporting a peaceful, inclusive, Syrian-led and Syrian-owned transition to help build a better future for all Syrians, and it will continue engaging with the transitional government and working closely with regional and international partners to that aim. The EU welcomes the commitment by the transitional government to build a new Syria based on national reconciliation, rule of law, and separation of powers, and the initial steps taken in this regard. Human rights and fundamental freedoms must be respected, protected, and fulfilled for everyone in Syria. The EU strongly condemns the violent clashes in Shuaida over the past few weeks. The transitional government, together with local authorities, bear the responsibility to protect all Syrians without distinction and to take all necessary steps towards disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of all armed groups into unified national security forces. A comprehensive and inclusive transitional justice process, Syrian-led and Syrian-owned, is a necessity for reconciliation and lasting peace. The EU calls for a swift, transparent, credible, and impartial investigation of the recent attacks on civilians in Syria's coastal region, Damascus area, and Shuaida, as well as for a transparent and victim-centered follow-up process. The EU calls on the transitional authorities to continue engaging in this respect with the international, impartial, and independent mechanism and the Commission of Inquiry. The EU also expresses its full support to the important work of the Independent Institution on Missing Persons in the Syrian Arab Republic. And we condemn any unilateral foreign military action and presence, as well as attempts to undermine Syria's stability and prospects for a peaceful transition, including through foreign information manipulation and interference. The EU in particular expresses deep concern at recent strikes in Damascus and in southern Syria, which jeopardize the lives of civilians and risk further fueling sectarianism and undermining Syria's transition. The European Union also calls on the transitional government to pursue the fight against international terrorism, in particular Daesh and al-Qaeda affiliates. The EU condemns the terrorist attack at the Mar Elias Church in Damascus and calls on the transitional government to ensure that those responsible are held into account. The EU calls on the transitional authorities to continue cooperating with the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons to eliminate Syria's chemical weapons program for good. The EU will continue to play a leading role in the humanitarian funding and is committed to supporting Syria on its path towards stabilization and reconstruction. The EU lifted, I remind, all its remaining economic sanctions on Syria, with the aim to support Syria's inclusive political transition as well as its swift economic recovery, reconstruction, and stabilization, while maintaining sanctions related to the Assad regime, sanctions based on security grounds, and introducing additional sanctions against human rights violators and those fueling instability in Syria. Mr. President, on Lebanon, the EU reiterates its support for the Lebanese people and welcomes the efforts of the new authorities to stabilize the economic and security situation. We continue to call on all parties to implement the terms of the 27 November 24 ceasefire agreement and for the implementation of UN Security Council Resolution 1701. We support the Lebanese state's sovereignty and territorial integrity. We recall the fundamental stabilization role of UNIFIL, to which EU member states significantly contribute, and commend UNIFIL's effective cooperation with the Lebanese armed forces. The EU will continue supporting the Lebanese armed forces to this effect, and we call for the renewal of UNIFIL's mandate. Thank you, Mr. President. The full statement is available online.
I thank His Excellency Mr. Lambrinidis for his statement, and now I give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Kyrgyzstan.
Mr. President, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, I also join other speakers to thank Pakistan for convening this important open debate on the situation in the Middle East. Let me also thank all high-level participants for their engagement, concern, and meaningful contributions to addressing one of the most pressing issues on the global agenda. Today, the Kyrgyz Republic speaks with a deep sense of responsibility and urgency regarding the situation in the Middle East, a region whose fate remains closely tied to the resolution of the Palestinian question. We reaffirm our unwavering commitment to promoting peace, justice, and stability in the region, grounded in dialogue, respect for international law, and the principles enshrined in the UN Charter. Mr. President, the Palestinian issue remains one of the most enduring and painful challenges for the international community. It continues to test our collective resolve to uphold the principles of justice and peaceful settlement of disputes. The suffering of the Palestinian people, decades of occupation, repeated cycles of violence, the destruction of vital infrastructure, and the displacement of innocent civilians demands our full and urgent attention. Kyrgyzstan firmly believes that a just, lasting, and a comprehensive solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is critical not only for regional stability, but for the credibility and integrity of the international security system as a whole. My country reaffirms its strong support of the two-state solution based on the relevant resolutions of the United Nations. It is the only viable path toward a just, lasting, and a peaceful coexistence of Israelis and Palestinians. We call for an immediate end of violence and further escalation, the protection of civilians with particular emphasis on the safety of women and children, the full and unimpeded delivery of humanitarian aid, especially in the Gaza Strip, where the humanitarian crisis has reached catastrophic levels, the ongoing blockade of assistance, the destruction of healthcare and civilian infrastructure, and the mass displacement of populations demand urgent international response. Kyrgyzstan believes the international community must prioritize the following steps: the resumption of diplomatic efforts under the auspices of the United Nations with the active engagement of the Quartet and regional stakeholders to pave the way for direct, increased support of UN agencies, particularly UNRWA, in their efforts to provide essential humanitarian relief to the Palestinian people, especially refugees, the promotion of confidence-building measures between the parties to reduce tensions and foster conditions for meaningful dialogue. Mr. President, the Kyrgyz Republic remains steadfast in its support for the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people and will continue to advocate for these rights across multilateral platforms, including the United Nations and the Organization of Islamic Cooperation. At the same time, we are mindful of the broader challenge facing the Middle East, ongoing conflicts and tensions, the threat of terrorism, the devastating impacts of climate change, and the critical shortage of resources. Kyrgyzstan underscores the importance of a comprehensive, balanced approach for peace and stability in the region. We call for expanded dialogue among all stakeholders and support inclusive diplomatic initiatives aimed at resolving protracted conflicts. We will continue to actively engage in global and regional efforts to promote lasting peace in the Middle East, strengthen the role of the United Nations, and help shape a more just and equitable international order. Let us work together to build a future rooted in dialogue, mutual respect, and international justice, a future in which the voices, rights, and aspirations of all nations in the region are heard, respected, and fulfilled. I thank you.
Thank the Permanent Representative of Kyrgyzstan for the statement, and now give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Thailand.
Mr. President, Thailand would like to commend your leadership
in convening this very important quarterly open debate. Thailand remains concerned about the dire situation in Gaza, marked by widespread destruction, severe humanitarian crisis, mass displacement, and ongoing hostilities. Equally alarming are the rising tensions in the wider Middle East in recent months, threatening peace, security, and stability in the region and beyond. At this very critical juncture, Mr. President, Thailand wishes to highlight 4 key points. First, we urge all parties concerned to exercise utmost restraint to prevent further escalation and regional spillover of the conflict, which would inevitably cause more suffering for innocent civilians. Thailand reiterates its firm call for an immediate, full, and sustained ceasefire in Gaza, and for the immediate and unconditional release of all hostages. We support ongoing diplomatic efforts by all parties to achieve a renewed ceasefire agreement, including recent negotiations in Doha. Second, Thailand remains gravely concerned about the deteriorating humanitarian situation in Gaza. We emphasize that humanitarian principles must be upheld and that timely and adequate assistance must be provided to civilians in need. We reiterate our appeal to the international community to mobilize support and assistance to UNRWA and to prevent any disruption to its operations and mandate, which would further deepen humanitarian suffering on the ground. Third, in light of the widespread destruction in Gaza, Thailand underscores the critical importance of reconstruction efforts to restore livelihoods and the well-being of the Palestinian people. We believe that such efforts are essential to paving the way for a sustainable, inclusive, and resilient recovery, which will, of course, in turn, contribute to the foundation for lasting peace and development in Gaza. Accordingly, Thailand welcomes and stands ready to support reconstruction initiatives, particularly those focused on rebuilding homes, essential infrastructure, and public facilities in close cooperation with the international community and relevant United Nations agencies. Last and most importantly, Thailand once again reaffirms our unwavering support for genuine dialogue between Israel and Palestine in line with the two-state solution, whereby the states of Israel and Palestine coexist side by side in peace, security, and mutual recognition in accordance with the international law and relevant United Nations resolutions. In this regard, Thailand is committed to engaging constructively and actively in the forthcoming high-level international conference on the two-state solution. This reflects our collective determination to support diplomatic efforts towards the goal of ending suffering and bringing sustainable and lasting peace and security to the Middle East. Mr. President, let us not lose sight of our collective responsibilities to secure peace for future generations. Thailand stands ready to work alongside all partners to help transform aspirations for peace in the Middle East into reality. I thank you very much.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Thailand for the statement and now give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Mexico.
Señor Presidente, México participa en este debate del Consejo de Seguridad sobre Medio Oriente con profunda preocupación por la creciente fragilidad en la región. Las recientes escaladas de violencia y el riesgo latente de una confrontación regional de impredecibles proporciones
regional confrontation of unpredictable proportions not only compromises the stability of the Middle East, but also threaten international peace and security. Against this backdrop, it is imperative to revitalize multilateral platforms that address the root causes of conflicts in the region. In this context, Mexico welcomes the resumption of the high-level conference on the two-state solution. The Israeli-Palestinian conflict remains perhaps one of the most long-standing within the multilateral system and holds particular significance for us due to the historical involvement of the UN. We cannot allow other crises to divert attention from the extremely serious humanitarian situation in Gaza and the West Bank. Every day as we meet, thousands of civilians die or are displaced, and famine is spreading at an alarming rate. We have observed that the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation mechanism established by Israel for the distribution of food in the Strip is both dangerous and ineffective. Mexico condemns the use of hunger as a weapon of war and regrets policies that propose the creation of the so-called closed humanitarian city. A two-state solution for Palestine involves the reconstruction of Gaza. Economic indicators reflect a critical situation. In 2024, food prices in Gaza rose by more than 200%, and the Palestinian gross domestic product declined by 28%. Furthermore, a sustainable solution requires security guarantees both for Israel and for a future Palestinian state, in accordance with relevant United Nations resolutions. In this regard, the establishment of a lasting ceasefire is an imperative to advance in any peace effort. On another note, attacks on nuclear facilities anywhere in the world represent a grave danger to civilian populations and to the environment, since radiological risks do not heed borders. We reiterate the importance of implementing the so-called 7 indispensable pillars for ensuring nuclear safety, technological and physical, nuclear safety and security during armed conflict. On the recent attacks perpetrated against Damascus, we issue a firm call for restraint. We urge all actors involved to refrain from action that might exacerbate tensions, undermine the political transition in Syria, and worsen the humanitarian situation in that country. Mr. President, in conclusion, we reiterate the importance that we attach to the respect for international law, in particular, international humanitarian law. It's urgent that we redouble diplomatic efforts, including the role incumbent on this Security Council towards a lasting peace in the Middle East. Thank you very much.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Mexico for the statement, and I'll give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Poland.
Mr. President, I would like to begin by thanking Pakistan for convening today's meeting and ASG Kyari for his briefing. Poland supports the broad statement delivered by the European Union. Mr. President, the time has come to renewed and genuine efforts to bring lasting peace to the Middle East. The region cannot afford further cycles of violence, despair, and a humanitarian catastrophe. Poland reaffirms its long-standing position that the Israelis' long-term security must be achieved through diplomatic engagement with its neighbors. The Abraham Accords, achieved under the US auspices, illustrate the potential of such diplomacy. However, their further development requires addressing the Palestinian question. We remain fully committed to the two-state solution. Poland recognized Palestinian statehood in 1988. We also remain engaged in preparation for the upcoming New York conference in support of that goal. Mr. President, while we recognize the Israelis' right to self-defense, we cannot accept actions that result in starvation of civilian population, including children, in the occupied Palestinian territories. Poland reiterates that the blockage of the Gaza Strip and restrictions on humanitarian aid constitute unacceptable violations of international law. We firmly oppose the instrumentalization of humanitarian needs for political or military aims. We further call for the protection of humanitarian aid and medical personnel and respect for international law. Recent attacks on religious sites, including churches, are unacceptable. Mr. President, Poland calls for immediate, full and sustained humanitarian access. The situation on the ground is extremely dramatic, and the most vulnerable continue to suffer the most. We hope that Israel's recent decisions to resume aid delivery will be swiftly implemented and expanded, including the opening of all border crossings for broad humanitarian operations. Poland reiterates the importance of resuming the activities of the UN agencies, particularly UNRWA, in the occupied territories. We observe with concern the introduction of the new aid mechanisms involving private companies, which risk undermining impartiality in humanitarian delivery. Mr. President, in conclusion, Poland remains steadfast in its commitment to protecting civilians. This week, alongside 25 like-minded foreign ministers, we supported a UK-led letter highlighting the urgent humanitarian situation in Gaza. We continue to uphold the principles of peace, human dignity, and international law. And I thank you.
I thank the Permanent Representative of Poland for the statement, and now give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Japan.
Thank you, Mr. President, for convening this open debate. Since our last open debate in April, the Middle East has faced the threat of a large-scale war, and innocent civilians continue to suffer unimaginable hardship. We remain deeply concerned over the current situation both in Gaza and the West Bank. The repeated acts of violence, the appalling humanitarian crisis, the settlement expansion, and the plight of the Palestinian people and that of the hostages cannot be tolerated anymore. This sense of urgency is the core of the joint statement issued by 29 partners, including my own country. Once again, all parties concerned must achieve an immediate ceasefire in Gaza and unconditional release of all remaining hostages. We commend the tireless mediation efforts of the United States, Egypt, and Qatar. A ceasefire is an essential cornerstone through which humanitarian aid can reach the vulnerable people of Gaza and lay the foundation for reconstruction and a renewed commitment to a two-state solution. In this regard, as the co-chair of the work group together with Norway on economic viability of the Palestinian state, we will actively contribute to the discussions at the upcoming conference for the implementation of the two-state solution. Our support for Palestinian economic development has continued for decades. This month, together with Malaysia and Palestine, Japan held the fourth ministerial meeting of the Conference on Cooperation among East Asia Countries for Palestinian Development, CPAD, a regional cooperation initiative launched by Japan in 2013. The conference adopted the Comprehensive Action Plan for Humanitarian Response, Early Recovery and Reconstruction, and Support for PA Reforms. Mr. President, the situation in Iran saw dramatic developments in June and remains volatile. We reiterate our support for the ceasefire between Israel and Iran and strongly urged all parties to avoid any destabilizing actions. Iran's development of nuclear weapons must not be allowed. We note the upcoming talks between the E3 and Iran and call for early resumption of the U.S.-Iran negotiations toward a solution to the Iranian nuclear issue. The IAEA's monitoring and verification is essential in this regard, and Japan strongly urges Iran to swiftly resume full cooperation with the agency. Based on our long-standing relationship with Iran, Japan will continue to make necessary diplomatic efforts. Mr. President, in Syria, while concrete progress has been made toward a political transition, Japan is deeply concerned by the continued violence, especially in the south. We call for steady implementation of the ceasefire agreement and strongly urge the utmost restraint. All parties must work constructively toward an inclusive political settlement and national reconciliation through dialogue. Syria's sovereignty, territorial integrity, and independence must be respected. In Yemen, we condemn the resumption of Houthis' attacks on commercial vessels. The Houthis must cease this reckless conduct immediately and release all detainees without delay. In Lebanon, where the ceasefire largely holds, the situation remains fragile with continued violations. All parties need to fully implement the ceasefire agreement and refrain from any escalation that puts civilians at risk and undermines regional peace and stability. To conclude, the international community must unite in the earnest pursuit of lasting resolutions of the numerous conflicts in the Middle East. Japan will continue to play its part to this end. I thank you.
Thanking the Permanent Representative of Japan for the statement, I now give the floor to the Permanent Representative of Vietnam.
Thank you, Mr. President. Vietnam thanks Pakistan for convening this open debate. We share deep concern over the prolonged conflict in Gaza, now in its 21st month, marked by relentless violence, attacks on women and children, and starvation of the civilian population. We regret that the Security Council remains unable to collectively address the crisis in Gaza and its broader regional implications. We call on the Council to take action to help put an end to the bloodshed and the untold suffering of the civilian population. Vietnam renews its call for restraint and full compliance with the UN Charter, international law, and relevant UN resolutions, as well as the provisional measures of the International Court of Justice. Protecting civilians and essential infrastructure must remain an absolute priority. We reiterate our urgent call for an immediate, enforceable, and permanent ceasefire, the release of all hostages, and the safe return of displaced Palestinians across Gaza. We commend the diplomatic efforts of relevant member states in pursuit of these objectives. Mr. President, the catastrophic humanitarian situation in Gaza demands urgent and coordinated action. We call for unhindered access to life-saving aid and reaffirm our strong support for UNRWA's vital role in coordinating and delivering humanitarian assistance. Vietnam reaffirms its steadfast support for the Palestinian people's right to self-determination and full UN membership. We remain a steadfast advocate for the two-state solution based on the pre-1967 borders and international law, ensuring a sovereign state of Palestine coexisting in peace and security with Israel. In this spirit, we welcome the resumption of the high-level international conference on the peaceful settlement of the question of Palestine, co-chaired by France and Saudi Arabia. Vietnam stands ready to contribute to post-conflict reconstruction in Gaza with a view to restoring peace, dignity, and livelihood for the Palestinian people. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of Vietnam, and I now give the floor to the representative of Spain.
Señor Presidente, agradezco la oportunidad de dirigirme a este Consejo en un momento de especial gravedad en toda la región de Oriente Próximo, que hace aún más necesario aunar esfuerzos para restablecer la paz y la estabilidad. La región sigue particularmente marcada por el conflicto palestino-israelí, con implicaciones en otros países que ha sumido la región en una espiral de violencia. La situación tanto en Gaza como en Cisjordania sigue siendo profundamente alarmante. Tras más de 21 meses de conflicto, la guerra ha provocado más de 57.600 civiles fallecidos, entre ellos miles de mujeres y niños. No podemos tolerar más muerte y destrucción en Gaza. El bloqueo humanitario ha desencadenado una severa hambruna que afecta a 2 millones de palestinos en Gaza, quienes además carecen de acceso a tratamientos médicos básicos. La situación en la franja es inhumana e inaceptable. Necesitamos devolver la dignidad al pueblo palestino. Esperamos que las partes alcancen próximamente un alto al fuego permanente que permita liberar a todos los rehenes en manos de Hamás, así como la entrada rápida e ininterrumpida de ayuda humanitaria. Seguiremos instando a que Israel permita operar sobre el terreno a las entidades de Naciones Unidas y al resto de actores humanitarios de tal forma que la distribución de ayuda humanitaria se realice conforme a los principios humanitarios. Nuestro apoyo, particularmente a UNRWA, sigue siendo inquebrantable, como hemos demostrado con la presidencia del Comité Asesor de la Agencia, que ha finalizado precisamente este mes de julio. La Fundación Humanitaria de Gaza ha fracasado en sus funciones. Expresamos nuestra profunda consternación por las más de 1.000 muertes que se han producido cerca de sus puntos de distribución. Quiero incidir en que la paz pasa por una solución política basada en la implementación de la solución de los dos estados. En este sentido, la conferencia de alto nivel que tendrá lugar la semana que viene representa una oportunidad para avanzar decididamente hacia el reconocimiento tanto de Palestina como de Israel y su integración regional. No desaprovechemos este momento político. El reconocimiento del Estado de Palestina representa un prerequisito fundamental para la paz y la estabilidad regional. En coherencia, España reconoció a Palestina en mayo del 2024, reafirmando así su compromiso con la implementación de la solución de los dos estados y contribuyendo activamente a los esfuerzos internacionales para poner fin al conflicto palestino-israelí. Señor presidente, la violencia nunca resolverá los problemas de Oriente Medio. España ha condenado la escalada de violencia entre Israel e Irán. Instamos a las partes a respetar el acuerdo de alto el fuego. No existe alternativa militar a una solución diplomática que asegure la naturaleza exclusivamente pacífica del dossier nuclear iraní. Urge alcanzar un acuerdo y pedimos que las partes que retomen las negociaciones de inmediato. Una paz justa y duradera en la región pasa necesariamente por la restauración del respeto a los principios de la Carta de Naciones Unidas, incluyendo el respeto a la integridad territorial, especialmente en Líbano y Siria. Existe una oportunidad histórica para avanzar en la estabilización del Líbano. España reitera su llamamiento a las partes para que se cumpla íntegramente la resolución 1701 de este Consejo de Seguridad y con el acuerdo de cese de hostilidades de noviembre de 2024. Seguiremos apoyando la aplicación a través de UNIFIL y el apoyo político y financiero a las Fuerzas Armadas del Líbano. El mandato de UNIFIL es indispensable para consolidar los avances logrados. Confiamos en que este Consejo mostrará su apoyo unánime a su renovación en agosto. España ha condenado la violencia en el sur de Siria, que debe ser investigada para que sus responsables no queden impunes. Ante las acciones militares de Israel en Damasco y otros puntos del país, España exige que se respete la soberanía e integridad territorial de Siria y seguir apoyando al pueblo sirio para avanzar en una transición política pacífica e inclusiva. España seguirá apostando por el diálogo con los socios regionales para promover la paz y la estabilidad en Oriente Próximo. Muchas gracias.
I thank the representative of Spain for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of United Arab Emirates.
السيد الرئيس في البداية أود أن أعرب عن شكري للسيد خالد خياري على الإحاطة الوافية التي قدمها هذا الصباح والتي سلطت الضوء على الواقع المرير والوحش الذي تمر به الأرض الفلسطينية وبالأخص قطاع
particularly in the Gaza Strip. I also align myself with the statements delivered by the Gulf Cooperation Council, the Arab Group, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, and the Non-Aligned Movement. The United Arab Emirates reiterates its strong condemnation of the devastating war in Gaza, unprecedented in both scale and intensity,
and the ongoing violence and grave violations committed against defenseless civilians, including indiscriminate killings and the widespread destruction of vital infrastructure in blatant disregard of international law. These actions have resulted in the displacement of thousands and have subjected countless women, children, the elderly, and the sick to immense suffering and the threat of death. My country also condemns the unjust blockade imposed by Israel on the Gaza Strip, which, alongside the systematic obstruction of humanitarian aid and attacks on those seeking it, has deepened an already dire humanitarian catastrophe. This blockade has triggered widespread famine, depleted essential supplies, and stood in clear violation of international humanitarian law and the Geneva Conventions. This was confirmed by the United Nations Secretary General and the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs in their recent warnings of widespread famine and the collapse of the humanitarian system in Gaza. In response to the magnitude of the humanitarian catastrophe in Gaza, the UAE has undertaken a series of initiatives under Operation Gallant Night. These efforts encompass the delivery of food assistance, the provision of essential supplies to sustain local bakeries, and the implementation of water desalination projects to address critical needs. Furthermore, the UAE has received hundreds of wounded and ailing individuals, along with their family members, for medical treatment at hospitals across the country. Despite all ongoing regional and international efforts to reach a ceasefire, secure the entry of humanitarian aid, and release of hostages, the absence of genuine political will has hindered any meaningful progress towards ending this war. This has allowed the bloodshed and human suffering to continue and at a tragic pace. We also draw attention to the dangerous escalation in the West Bank, marked by repeated incursions, arbitrary arrests, violent attacks against civilians, and the continued expansion of illegal settlements and attacks on the property of civilians, which represents a clear violation of international law and undermines the prospects of achieving a just and lasting peace. In this context, the UAE reiterates its unequivocal rejection of all Israeli practices that violate the rights of the Palestinian people, whether in Gaza or across the occupied Palestinian territory. This includes the abusive practices at the Al-Aqsa Mosque compound, as well as the Israeli plan to transfer the administration and oversight of the Ibrahimi Mosque from the Palestinian Ministry of Endowments and Religious Affairs and the municipality of Al-Khalil to the Jewish Religious Council, an act which my country strongly condemns and denounces. As we move forward, it is essential that we work together with unwavering resolve to advance the following four key demands. First, securing an immediate, lasting and unconditional ceasefire and releasing detainees, hostages and prisoners. In this context, we renew our support to the mediation efforts led by the State of Qatar, the Arab Republic of Egypt and the United States. Second, lifting the blockade imposed on the Gaza Strip and ensuring the protection of all civilians, while enabling the United Nations, particularly UNRWA, to fulfill its vital and indispensable humanitarian mandate by delivering large-scale aid safely and effectively to all those in need, in full compliance with the principles of neutrality, impartiality and independence. Key humanitarian principles. Third, halting all actions aimed at forcibly displacing Palestinians or altering the demographic composition across all areas of the occupied Palestinian territory. Fourth, ending the occupation, halting all settlement activities, and revitalizing the political process based on the two-stage solution. This remains the only viable path to breaking the cycle of violence and advancing forward towards the establishment of an independent and sovereign Palestinian state with East Jerusalem as its capital, living side by side with Israel in peace and security. In this regard, we welcome the announcement of the resumption of the International Conference on the Peaceful Settlement of the Question of Palestine and the implementation of the two-state solution, co-chaired by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and the Republic of France. And we are hopeful that it will yield tangible steps toward ending the conflict and fostering security and stability in the region. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the representative of the United Arab Emirates for his statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Norway.
President, the situation in Palestine is catastrophic. We are beyond words to describe the conditions in Gaza. Palestinian civilians are facing starvation, disease, and death. The Israeli hostages continue to suffer terribly. This is totally unacceptable. We repeat to all parties, the war must end now. Norway is extremely concerned about the lack of access to critical aid and basic goods in Gaza. The Israeli government's aid delivery regime is both highly insufficient and dangerous. Since the end of May, over 1,000 Palestinians have been killed while seeking aid. This cannot continue. Civilians must be protected. The restrictions on the flow of aid must be lifted immediately. As the occupying power, Israel must ensure that people have food and medical supplies and enable the UN and humanitarian organizations to do their life-saving work safely, effectively, in line with international humanitarian law and with the safety of the civilian population as a priority. Instead, conditions for the UN are worsening. Thousands of UN aid trucks remain blocked from entering Gaza, with stocks that could have fed Gaza's entire population for 3 months. Heavy bombardments are reported close to UN installations in Deir al-Balah, with UN installations being damaged or under threat. WHO's staff residence and main warehouse in Gaza were damaged this week when an attack caused explosions and a fire inside. Humanitarian and health workers must be protected. UN staff in Gaza are fainting and collapsing due to starvation and lack of water while on duty. Desperate pleas from UN staff are being received daily, urging the international community to act. As Norway has argued in our statement to the International Court of Justice in April, Israel is required under international law to provide cooperation, facilitation, assistance, and protection for the international presence to continue their activities in the occupied Palestine territory. This includes the courageous UN staff working on the ground in Palestine. To quote UN Relief Chief Tom Fletcher, "They are the best of the UN and of all of us." President, as has been underscored in this Council again and again, reaching a two-state solution is a prerequisite for durable peace and security for Palestinians and Israelis alike. Norway remains committed. Let us use the upcoming conference on a two-state solution next week to intensify our efforts to bring this terrible conflict to an end. Thank you.
I thank the representative of Norway for her statement. I now give the floor to the representative of Malaysia.
Thank you, President. Malaysia thanks Pakistan for convening this meeting and aligns itself with the statements of NAM and the OIC. President, this Council has convened numerous times to discuss the situation in the Middle East since the horrific war in Gaza began. Copious, alarming reports and distressing accounts have been heard from a broad range of UN officials and other experts. The International Court of Justice issued multiple orders of provisional measures in January, March, and May 2024 due to the possibility of a genocide being committed in Gaza, and yet no credible action has been taken. Almost 60,000 deaths have been recorded, the majority women and children. Thousands more bodies are still buried under the rubble. More than 140,000 have been injured. UNICEF estimates that between 3,000 to 4,000 children in Gaza have had one or more limbs amputated. Gaza is now the home of more child amputees per inhabitants than anywhere else in the world. About 2 million Gazans have been forcibly displaced, many of them multiple times. 92% of housing units have been damaged or destroyed, while 70 to 80% of civilian infrastructure, including schools, hospitals, and roads, are completely destroyed or damaged. 330 UNRWA staff have been killed, the highest number in the UN history. More than 200 journalists and media personnel have also become casualties, also a new record. The situation in Gaza had been described as catastrophic months ago. Gaza is said to be a graveyard for children and worse than hell on earth. And yet, this Council continues to be unmoved, unresponsive, and unable to get its act together, allowing the humanitarian condition to deteriorate and massacre of Palestinians to continue. Now the situation has worsened to an even more unimaginable level. Since the setup of the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation in May, the shooting and killing of civilians at its food distribution sites has become almost a daily routine. So far, about 1,000 Palestinians have been killed. This is outrageous, and it must be stopped. President, surely we have said and heard enough. What is needed is for the Council to deliver on its mandate. What the entire world has been waiting is for united, firm, and bold actions by this Council to uphold the UN Charter and international law. Israel's genocidal war in Gaza must be stopped. Israel must be held accountable for the multitude of war crimes that it has committed, including using starvation as a weapon of war. In the West Bank, Israel's military operations have increased in its scale, frequency, and brutality. Settler violence has also heightened, as well as expansion of illegal settlements. The impunity that Israel enjoys has emboldened it to intensify its belligerence, not only in the occupied Palestinian territory, but throughout the region. Recently, we have witnessed how Israel has thrown the wider region into chaos and instability by its reckless military actions on Iran, Lebanon, and Syria. Clearly, Israel is acting as if it is above the law. President, the Security Council must act decisively before it is too late. What is at stake is not only the extermination of an entire people, but also the total collapse of the rule-based order. Make no mistake, the Council's actions or inactions today may very well determine whether we will continue to live in peace, guided by international law, or regress into a world of lawlessness where might is right. Thank you.
I thank the permanent representative of Malaysia for the statement. There are still a number of speakers remaining on the list for this meeting. I intend, with the concurrence of members of the Council, to suspend the meeting until 24th of July. The meeting is suspended.